and I'd like to welcome you to our symposium on the General Haremhab, who was the general who became king. This is in conjunction with our special exhibition, which is right across the hall if you haven't seen it. The exhibition was organized by Dorothea Arnold, the head of our department, and the purpose of the exhibition was partly to focus on one of our great works of art, this scribe statue of Haremhab, where he is shown in the seated position of a man who knows how to read and write, a scribe. We know first about Haremhab when he is the commander-in-chief of the army of Tutankhamun. And today I'm going to give you a very brief introduction for any of you who don't know about the history of Egypt. I seem to see mostly Egyptologists and others in the audience at the moment, but I will go through this in any case. As you see from the chronology, we have put an explanation that the chronology of this time in Egypt is under discussion, which means the dates that we show here are not the dates you will find in our galleries or on our website. We are in the process of trying to decide how to change the dates for the new kingdom of this period. And our colleagues in academics are usually changing bits and pieces of the chronology quite frequently. We do not follow them immediately because, of course, our chronology is written down on thousands of labels. It's on the website. It's in our database. So we only really change the chronology every 10 or even 20 years when we have some good data. But that's not precisely what we're going to talk about today. We're going to get together tomorrow and talk about that subject. Today, we're going to talk about Haremhab, and you will need to know the kings that are listed here. We start with Amenhotep III, who rules for nearly 40 years, towards the end of the 18th dynasty. And then he is important for this period because he's the father of Amenhotep IV, who becomes Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king of the end of the 18th dynasty. Akhenaten is the one who tries to create a religion that worships a single deity, Aten, the sun disk, or the light of the sun. And he tries to wipe out the worship of the other gods, in particular, the god Amun of Thebes. He rules for 17 years, and towards the end of his reign, we find two names, Nefer-Neferu-Aten and Smenkhare. In our old chronology, we have those two names in the end of Akhenaten's reign, sort of reigning concurrently with him. We do not know precisely who these people are. We have very little information on them. In this chronology, you will see that we give Smenkhare a couple of years of his own rule, and Nefer-Neferu-Aten a slight overlap. But Tutankhamun is the next king with any number of years, and he reigns for 9 years, and of course, he dies without any heirs, which potentially is a disaster for Egypt. At the end of dynasties, when there is no good heir to the throne that can keep Egypt united, it often falls into its two geographical sections, the Delta and the Nile Valley, and this can be a time of real problems for Egypt and lowered prosperity and even real chaos. So the Egyptians really want a king that can keep Egypt united. In the case of Tutankhamun, he is succeeded by a man named Aya, who is not a member of the royal family. He has served under both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, so he is an elder statesman. And his wife, Tia, has a title royal of the nurse of Nefertiti, which means she's the wet nurse of Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten. This gives her a particularly close connection to the royal family. And in the 18th dynasty, royal nurses and their families tend to have very close ties to the Egyptian royal family. So this may be one, it's certainly not the principal, but it may be one of the reasons why Aya becomes the successor of Tutankhamun. He only rules for 4 years or 3 years. He also has no heirs. And so Haremhab, who is the chief of the army under Tutankhamun and also one of the diplomats who is sent on diplomatic missions by the king, becomes the king of Egypt. He probably, because of his great prominence under the reign of Tutankhamun, he probably gained all of his experience under the reign of Akhenaten, but we can't absolutely trace him in that time. We really only know him from the time of Tutankhamun. But as you can see, he portrays himself as a scribe, which means he is a man who knows how to read and write, or at least he's portraying himself in this way, which means he has the skills to become a great king. He has the military skills and he has the administrative skills. Unfortunately, even Horemheb, who is middle-aged when he comes to the throne, does not have an heir. And so he seems at the end of his life to appoint, to choose a man who is his vizier, Paramses. Paramses becomes Ramses I. He also seems to have been a colleague of Haremhab when he was himself in the army. So Ramses himself has these skills to become a king, but he has something more important. He has a son who is already an adult. This is Seti, who becomes Seti I. And Seti already has a son who becomes Ramses II. So we have a ready-made dynasty here, which is a very important thing for Egypt. And when he chooses Ramses, Horemheb cannot possibly have known the great choice he was making, because Ramses I, Seti I, and Ramses II rule for at least the next 75 years, which is nearly a century of order for Egypt, and this is very important for Egypt. I find it very interesting that Horemheb, who we put at the end of the 18th dynasty, begins his career under Tutankhamun, who is, of course, in modern times, one of the most recognizable names of a king. And towards the end of his life, he probably knows Ramses II before Ramses becomes king. So this one man knew two of the kings who to us are the best known of Egyptian history, Tutankhamun and Ramses the Great. As you can see, Horemheb is a transitional king. He's not related to the Thutmosid kings of the 18th dynasty. He is also not related by blood, as far as we know, to the Ramesside kings of the 19th. Conventionally, we usually place him at the end of the 18th dynasty. But in fact, we could as easily place him at the beginning of the 19th dynasty. In fact, I personally often think of him as the first king of the 19th dynasty. My specialty happens to be architecture of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And to me, Horemheb's royal tomb is the first Ramesside tomb. It is the first tomb that has essentially a straight axis, unlike the 18th dynasty tombs, all of which, if they are completed, have either a curved axis or a right-angled turn in the axis. And more importantly, he's the first king who puts the Book of Gates, one of the great underworld books, into his tomb. This is never used in the 18th dynasty. It becomes one of the principal texts that is used in 19th dynasty kings' tombs. Well, today, our speakers are going to give you an introduction to the time of Horemheb and to the man himself. We are going to have 3 lectures this morning. We will probably not have time for questions. We will break for lunch, and then this afternoon we will come back at 2 o'clock for 3 more lectures and a half hour of discussion, and then our colleague James Allen from Brown, who used to be a curator in our department here, will give a summation. And there will be some time in the afternoon probably if you have questions for our speakers. Also, tomorrow afternoon at 6 o'clock, we have a lecture by Jeffrey Martin, who will be speaking about his work in the tomb of Tutankhamun, or the tomb of Horemheb in the Valley of the Kings. His lecture is at 6 o'clock in the Bonnie J. Sacerdote Lecture Hall over in the Uris Center, which is in the south side of the building in the basement. Our first speaker today, and I'm going to introduce each of the speakers very briefly because I want to give them as much time to speak as they have. Our first speaker today is Jacobus van Dijk, who is Associate Professor of Egyptology at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. His specialty is New Kingdom history and epigraphy, and he has recently written some very important articles on chronology and specifically on Horemheb and the number of years he probably reigned. He was here, I think it was in February, to be our speaker for the Wilkinson Lectures when he presented another lecture on the time of Horemheb. And today he's going to talk to us about the pre-royal career of Horemheb, how and when the general became king. So please welcome Professor Jacobus van Dijk.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about the pre-royal career of Horemheb, and as you see, the subtitle suggests that I will provide an answer to two important questions: how and when the general became king. The truth is, of course, that we don't really know. I'm going to present a possible scenario, but others are possible as well. One of the many problems connecting with the final decades of the 18th dynasty revolves around the exact nature of the position of Horemheb before he finally became king. What was his precise role during the reign of Tutankhamun, and what was his position vis-à-vis Ai, both before and after the latter had succeeded Tutankhamun? And how did Horemheb's accession finally come about? Of course, it has long been recognized that Horemheb acted as regent for Tutankhamun, but the mere fact that it was not Horemheb but Ai who succeeded Tutankhamun has led some scholars to assume that Ai must in some way have outranked him. Virtually nothing is known about Horemheb's career before he rose to prominence under Tutankhamun. There have been various attempts to identify him with persons named Horemheb from the time before Tutankhamun, but the name is not uncommon, and there is no other evidence to connect any of these men with our Horemheb. It has also been suggested that he is to be recognized in a man called Pa'atan-emheb, who started building a tomb at Amarna, but didn't get any further than the entrance with two door jambs, with inscriptions in black outline drawing only. Even the reading of this man's titles is uncertain. He was steward of the land of the Lord of the Two Lands, overseer of works in Akhetaten, and, at least according to one early copyist, overseer of the army of the Lord of the Two Lands. Horemheb's early military career must have taken place during the Amarna period, that stands to reason. But this Pa'atan-emheb is the same person as the future great commander-in-chief of the armies of Tutankhamun seems rather unlikely, quite apart from the questionable assumption that this man changed his name to Horemheb after the Amarna period. In his coronation text, to which we shall come in a moment, Horemheb places great emphasis on his link with the god Horus of Hut-Nezu, and for that reason it has often been speculated that Horemheb was born in Hut-Nezu, present-day Kom el-Ahmar. This is a very early 19th century drawing of the site, and there its location. This is perfectly possible, although far from certain. Hut-Nezu is often thought of as an insignificant provincial town, but it is interesting that 3 mud ceilings from papyrus rolls mentioning Horus of Hut-Nezu have been found in the palace complex of Amenhotep III at Malkata. A survey and excavation at Kom el-Ahmar carried out by the University of Tübingen in the 1980s turned up some Amarna blocks, which the excavators think are from a local Aten temple. If Horemheb hailed from Hut-Nezu, evidence of his pre-Tutankhamun career may well lay hidden under this largely unexplored site. In the coronation text just mentioned, inscribed on the back of a statue of Horemheb and his queen Mutnojmet in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Horemheb describes his exalted position at the court of an unnamed king who must surely be Tutankhamun, a position which he says he owed to his local god, Horus of Hut-Nezu. This god distinguished his son in the sight of the entire people in preparation for the day that he would be given the kingship. And this fact didn't escape the attention of the king, who was content with his dealings and rejoiced at the choice of him. The king, therefore, appointed him as supreme commander of the land in order to enforce the laws of the two shores as hereditary prince of this entire land, Iripat and Tapen Mikedef. Over a period of many years, Horemheb thus governed the two lands as the king's deputy. And the king's courtiers, as well as the rulers of foreign lands, conducted their business with him rather than with the king. At the beginning of the second part of the text, this extraordinary position of Horemheb is again emphasized by calling him not only supreme commander and hereditary prince, Iripat, of this entire land, but also eldest son of Horus, that is, of the divine king, a title which can only refer to the position of crown prince. Taken at face value, this unique document presents us with a very clear picture of Horemheb's position during the reign of Tutankhamun. That king had not only appointed him as his deputy, who effectively ruled Egypt, but he had also given him the position of hereditary prince and eldest son of Horus, crown prince, destined to eventually succeed him on the throne of Egypt. Gardiner has already stressed this point, referring to the well-known passage from the great dedicatory inscription of Ramesses II at Abydos, in which this famous monarch tells how he was chosen by his father Seti I to succeed him and was inducted as eldest son and hereditary prince upon the throne of Geb. That this was not an attempt on the part of Horemheb to rewrite history once he had become king, as has been suggested, is fully confirmed by the inscriptions in his Memphite tomb. There it is. The date of this monument has now been established beyond any doubt as being the reign of Tutankhamun. His cartouches are to be found on this magnificent scene on the south wall of the inner courtyard of the temple, of the tomb. These cartouches have later been usurped by Horemheb as king, but traces of the names of Tutankhamun survive. There it is. The subject of this scene is Horemheb being decorated with the famous gold of honor, and the royal couple depicted in this scene, and in an adjacent scene which shows Horemheb acting as an intermediary. I think I skipped one. There it is, yeah. It shows Horemheb acting as an intermediary between the king and a group of subject foreign rulers. And this royal couple is therefore to be identified as Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. This makes it very unlikely from the start that any titles and honors claimed by Horemheb in the inscriptions in the tomb should be fictitious. Virtually all of the titles mentioned in the coronation text are also found in the tomb. Most famously, his appointment as hereditary prince, Iripat, of the entire land, which Horemheb claims he received in the coronation text, is fully confirmed by the inscriptions in the tomb. The Iripat title on its own, that is, here it is, of course, not as part of a standard series of titles like Iripat, Hatia, Sajauti, Biti, Semerwati, etc., is very frequent in the tomb. Here you can see these asterisks mark the inscriptions in which this title occurs. And the title often stands alone. Helk and Gardner have amply demonstrated that the title Iripat, when it stands alone, contains the notions of what they call ancient descent and lawful inheritance, and it is virtually synonymous with our crown prince. This was clearly Horemheb's foremost title, and several inscriptions in the tomb and elsewhere. Here, for example, the scribe of Horemheb standing behind his chair is referring to Horemheb as the Iripat, in one inscription even without mentioning his name. And this famous block in Berlin also shows what is very likely the figure of Horemheb with just the title Iripat and Overseer of the Army. So it is clear that Horemheb was known as the Iripat, the crown prince, just as Ai was known as Pa-Itnecher, the god's father, and Maya as Pa-Imir Perhej, the chief treasurer. Any lingering doubts about the meaning of this Iripat title may be dispelled by looking at a stela of Crown Prince Meremta, son and successor of Ramesses II, from the Serapeum at Saqqara. On this stela, Meremta is called Royal Scribe Iripat, Great General of the Army, and eldest king's son of his body. And as such, he is shown wearing the uraeus, even though he was not yet king. The two members of his staff who dedicated the stela are the scribe of the Iripat, Chai, and the courier, Shemesu, of the Iripat, Sementawi. In Horemheb's case, the title can even be expanded to Iripat of Upper and Lower Egypt. According to the coronation text, the Iripat Horemheb governed Egypt as the king's deputy. In the tomb, he is called Deputy of the King in every place, Deputy of His Majesty in the entire land. The coronation text also says that Horemheb was summoned before the sovereign when chaos had broken out in the palace, and had opened his mouth and answered the king and reassured him with the words of his mouth. This might well mean that it was Horemheb who advised the king to abandon Amarna and make a fresh start at Memphis and Thebes. This would imply that Horemheb seized power immediately after the death of Tutankhamun's predecessor. Such an early date is confirmed by the evidence from the Memphite tomb, the construction of which was almost certainly begun in Tutankhamun's first regnal year, and whose first occupant was Horemheb's first wife, who was probably buried in the tomb in year 1 or early in year 2 of Tutankhamun. The inner courtyard of the tomb is thus firmly dated to the reign of Tutankhamun by the twofold depiction of the royal couple and Tutankhamun's cartouches. The date of the outer courtyard, on the other hand, is considerably more difficult to establish. The present court is the result of a change of plan, in which an original forecourt with undecorated mud brick walls was extended to a peristyle courtyard with limestone revetment and paving, 24 columns, and a massive pylon faced with limestone blocks. The relief decoration in the outer courtyard was never finished. Obviously, the work on the tomb was abandoned at some stage. Unfortunately, no cartouches have survived in the preserved parts of the outer courtyard, which could help us determine when this happened. But there is some circumstantial evidence that this extension was carried out, or if it had been begun earlier, continued during the reign of Ai, suggesting that the work was abandoned when Horemheb became king. It is likely that during Ai's reign, Horemheb was no longer Iripat and deputy of the king, and it is significant that the inscribed panels on the columns in the outer courtyard no longer mention these titles. One of the surviving relief blocks from the outer courtyard may actually depict Ai, although his name has not survived. The block shows two main figures, one of whom is depicted on a much larger scale than the other. Here's the magnificent drawing by Geoffrey Martin of the same scene. The smaller man on the left is shown being awarded the Gold of Honor by the man on the right. Above the scene are the tantalizing ends of 7 columns of text, but as with so many isolated blocks, the most important part of this text, including the names of the persons involved, was inscribed on the missing block which was once positioned above it. One would obviously expect the larger figure to be the king, who is shown rewarding high officials with the Gold of Honor in all known parallels of the scene. But here, the dress worn by the larger figure bears no royal characteristics. Two possible solutions have been suggested. Either the large figure is that of I before he became king, rewarding Horemheb with the gold of honor, or it is that of Horemheb himself in his function of deputy of the king. The smaller figure would then be a high-ranking contemporary of Horemheb in the army or civil administration. Because the direction of the hieroglyphs in the inscription agrees with that of the larger figure, and the titles mentioned are used elsewhere in the tomb of Horemheb, it has been assumed that the larger figure must be Horemheb. The smaller figure might then be Horemheb's subordinate, Paramesu, who, after Horemheb had become king, was appointed Iripat, and who eventually succeeded him as Ramesses I. To me, however, this interpretation is unlikely. First of all, there is the total lack of parallels, despite the considerable number of gold of honor scenes in tombs at Thebes and Amarna and elsewhere, including the scene in the inner courtyard of the tomb of Horemheb itself. In all of these scenes, it is the king who rewards his servant with a gold of honor, not a private individual. And what's more, it is in the recipient's tomb that this scene is always depicted. There are no examples in which the tomb owner is the one who awards the gold of honor rather than receiving it. And it is therefore a priori more likely that the recipient in the scene in the outer courtyard is Horemheb himself, not some other official. It is certainly true that the text inscribed above the scene agrees in direction with the larger figure, and that the titles mentioned in the first column of this text are those of Horemheb, but this can be explained by comparing it with the scene in the Amarna tomb of Merirei. Here the tomb owner receives the gold of honor from Akhenaten. The text inscribed in front of the figure of the king records his speech. What is spoken by the king of Upper and Lower Egypt: "Let the overseer of the treasury reward the high priest of the Aten in Achat-Aten, Merirei, put gold around his neck, on his back, and on his feet, because of his obedience to the instructions of Pharaoh." Now, if we reverse the scene in Merirei, and we pretend for a moment that it is not a complete wall scene, but just a block, like the one in Horemheb, the parallels become even more obvious. The titles of Merirei happen to be inscribed at the end of the first column. But because they form part of the speech of the king, they agree in direction with the king's figure, not with that of the much smaller figure of Merirei. The same almost certainly applies to the scene on the block of Horemheb, and the position of the titles of Horemheb mentioned on it therefore don't necessarily mean that the larger figure must be him rather than the king. In fact, the way the large figure stretches out his right arm and his open palm towards the recipient of the honors confirms that he is indeed addressing him. I therefore propose to identify the larger figure as that of the king. The smaller figure, with its remarkably realistic features, would then be Horemheb himself, and the relief would thus provide us with the only surviving true portrait of the great man. Obviously, the main obstacle to the proposed identification remains the dress of the larger figure. If this figure is not Horemheb, and isn't a proper king either, then he can be nobody else but I. I is perhaps the only king of the period who might conceivably be shown in a dress which, to all intents and purposes, is that of a private individual. There is some evidence to suggest that I only became king as a temporary solution to the problem of succession posed by Tutankhamun's sudden death, and that he was in fact a kind of interim king. I included his pre-royal title Itnecher, God's father, in his royal cartouche, which went against all tradition. The obvious parallel for this is Herihor, at the beginning of the 21st dynasty, who included his title of High Priest of Amun in his cartouche. In a famous scene in the tomb of Tutankhamun, I is shown wearing the leopard skin of the Sem priest, and apart from the blue crown, nothing in his attire distinguishes his figure as royal. Kings are very rarely represented wearing the leopard skin of the sempriest. Even when they are shown officiating in temple reliefs, they are almost always dressed in royal attire, not as a priest. Again, there is a parallel with Herihor. In the temple of Honsu, Herihor is shown more than once officiating while wearing the leopard skin. In fact, the only reward scene in which the gold of honor is handed out by a quasi-royal figure rather than the king himself is the very last example of such a scene, in the late 20th dynasty tomb of Amenemope, where the owner is awarded the gold of honor by the high priest of Amun, almost certainly Herihor. Unfortunately, this scene is known only from a very early drawing from Rossellini, and its reliability as far as the inscriptions are concerned have been questioned. But anyway, it's most likely to be Herihor. As with Herihor, these and other anomalies point to the abnormal status of Ai's kingship, and such a status could easily be reflected in the scene in Horemheb's outer courtyard as well. From what we have discussed so far, it is perfectly clear that not only did Horemheb act as Tutankhamun's regent, but he was officially appointed as the king's crown prince, destined to succeed him on the throne of Egypt in the event of the king dying without issue. Whether Horemheb's appointment was self-instigated is a moot point. Even if it was, and considering Tutankhamun's tender age at his accession, it is hard to escape such a conclusion, it would still be recorded in official inscriptions as the king's personal decision. Tutankhamun, or Tutankhaten as he was then still known, was the only surviving male member of the royal family. Clearly, no older member of the family could act as regent, as had been the case with kings in the past, who had come to the throne very young. This itself raises a serious objection against the assumption that Ai outranked Horemheb, for example, because of his supposed blood links with the royal family. Had this really been the case, then Ai would have been the logical candidate for the position of Iripat and king's deputy, not Horemheb. There can be no doubt that nobody outranked Horemheb except the king himself, and that Horemheb was entitled to the throne once the king had died unexpectedly without issue. This means that Ai, and not Horemheb, must be considered a usurper, and that it is Ai's, not Horemheb's accession which calls for an explanation. Why was Ai able to ascend the throne upon the death of Tutankhamun, despite the fact that Horemheb had at that time already been the official heir to the throne for most of a decade? I believe that the answer may well have to be sought in Egypt's foreign affairs and the impact these had on the political situation at home. During the Amarna period and after, Egypt was involved in a struggle with the Hittites over territories in northern Syria and Palestine. The Hittite document known as the Deeds of Shupi-Luliuma and other sources describe how the Egyptians had launched an attack on Kadesh from the south, and that in the following counterattack by Shupi-Luliuma, the Egyptians were dealt a serious blow at Amka, in Egyptian-controlled territory. And there is the region of Amka. The Hittite sources make it clear that the Egyptian defeat at Amka took place around the same time as the death of Nibhururia, the Egyptian king. These events were followed by the famous so-called Dahamunzu episode. From the deeds of Shupi-Luliuma and other Hittite sources, it emerges that after the death of Nibhururia, who I still believe on philological and historical grounds can only be Nebkheperu-Ra, Tutankhamun, his widow, who was Dahamunzu, queen of Egypt, wrote to Shupi-Luliuma asking him for a son. "My husband has died, I have no son, but you, they say, have many sons. If you would give me a son of yours, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband." This extraordinary request raised great suspicions with Shupilululiuma, and the result was a long period of delay, during which Shupilululiuma sent an envoy to Egypt to investigate the truth of the matter. This envoy didn't return until the following spring, bringing with him a second letter from the queen, repeating her request, and an Egyptian messenger who was to explain the situation to Shupilululiuma and convince him of the queen's honorable intentions. In this he succeeded, and Shupilululiuma's son Zananza was finally sent to Egypt. He would never arrive there, however, for he was murdered on the journey. If Horemheb was Tutankhamun's heir designate, and there can be little doubt that he was, Ankhesenamun's action becomes even more remarkable. At the death of Tutankhamun, Horemheb was fully entitled to become the next king of Egypt. Yet Ankhesenamun passed him over and wrote to Egypt's enemy for a son to succeed her deceased husband. In view of Horemheb's legitimate claim to the throne, there can be little doubt that the queen had a very specific person in mind when she assured Shupilululiuma that she would never pick a servant of mine and make him my husband. Whether her motives were personal or political or both, she clearly didn't want to marry Horemheb and thereby make him king. That the principal motive was a political one is suggested by the fact that she wrote to Shupilululiuma that through this marriage, Egypt and Hatti should become one country. It was to be a diplomatic marriage, and Ankhesenamun's overtures have therefore rightly been interpreted as a peace initiative, prompted by those who were willing to come to terms with the Hittites over Syria. The delays caused by Shupilululiuma's distrust and the long time it took for messengers to cover the distance between Egypt and Hatti meant that I had to mount the throne to fulfill the necessary role of Horus, successor of the dead Osiris king, until Ankhesenamun could marry her Hittite prince. After all, the mythical institution of divine kingship demanded that on the morning following the death of his predecessor, the new king should arise on the Horus throne of the living, and an interregnum during which no one was pharaoh was therefore impossible. Since it was Horemheb, not I, who was legally entitled to the throne, an explanation must be sought for I's coup d'etat. The fact that Egypt was involved in a military conflict with the Hittites in northern Syria at the time of Tutankhamun's death lends support to the idea, first put forward by Helk, that Horemheb, being the great commander-in-chief of Tutankhamun's army, was on the battlefield in northern Syria when the king died. The reliefs and inscriptions in the inner courtyard of his Memphite tomb demonstrate that he had been leading Tutankhamun's earlier military campaigns in Syria. And in one inscription, he boasts that his name was pronounced throughout the land of the Hittites after he had traveled northwards. The impression that Horemheb was abroad at the time of the crisis at home, which resulted from the sudden death of Tutankhamun, is further strengthened by the startling fact that Horemheb doesn't seem to have been involved at all in the burial arrangements for Tutankhamun, despite his very close association with the king when he was still alive. Even a relatively obscure person like Nacht Min, a relative of Ai, and it should be noted a subordinate of Horemheb in the army, was allowed to donate a set of shaptis to the dead king, as did Horemheb's close colleague Maya. It is sometimes suggested that the man shown closest to the bier in the funeral procession of Tutankhamun, in the paintings in the burial chamber, represents Horemheb, but there is no real evidence for that. It is hard to imagine that Ankhesenamun could have got away with her actions had Horemheb been in residence at the time of Tutankhamun's death. If, however, he was in northern Syria when the king died, the queen and the peace faction at court who supported her had the perfect opportunity to take action behind his back. Horemheb, being the great commander of Egypt's army and moreover engaged in a military conflict with the Hittites at the very moment the queen wrote to Egypt's enemy, was probably not among the peace faction and must have considered Ankhesenamun's initiative as a stab in the back. News of Tutankhamun's sudden and unexpected demise must have reached Horemheb at around the same time as the Queen's first letter reached Shupilululiuma, who was also in northern Syria at the time, preparing his assault on Carchemish. The 70-day period between death and burial should have been sufficient for Horemheb to travel back to Egypt and take matters in hand. Whether he did so or not, we don't know. But even if he did, it was probably too late when he arrived home, for I had forestalled his actions by mounting the throne. I seem to have misplaced it. I'm sorry, I seem to be missing a page. It has sometimes been suggested that the fact that Ayes succeeded Tutankhamun and not Horemheb was the result of an amicable arrangement between the two men, but this is not very likely because of the treatment that the monuments of Ay and his family received after the death of Ay, after Horemheb had become king. First of all, there is still this ring I wanted to briefly discuss. It's a ring in the Museum of Berlin which has the cartouches of Ankhis and Amun and Ay together, and it has often been suggested that this documents a marriage between the two. But this is not very likely because that would also run completely counter to the letter of the queen to the king of the Hittites, that she didn't want to marry a servant of hers. So it probably documents a brief co-regency or joint rule of the widow Ankhis and Amun and Ay. After the death of Ay and after the accession of Horemheb, he destroyed the monuments of Ay in a very deliberate campaign. These scenes, for example, in the burial chamber of Ay, all the figures of Ay himself have been thoroughly hacked out, as have been his cartouches. All the figures of the gods and goddesses are still intact. Even the royal Ka was left untouched, but Ay himself was completely removed. Even in that long text, you see that all the cartouches of Ay have been hacked out and not been replaced by someone else's cartouches, like Horemheb himself, for example. A particularly interesting erasure occurs on the restoration stela of Tutankhamun. The cartouches of Tutankhamun have been replaced by those of Horemheb, but the two figures of Ankhis and Amun, which once stood behind those of Tutankhamun, and the inscriptions identifying her have been thoroughly erased. It would have been very easy for Horemheb to replace Ankhis and Amun's cartouches with those of his own queen, Mutnojmet, but he chose to do otherwise. It would seem that the damnatio memoriae of Ankhis and Amun, witnessed by the erasures on the restoration stela, was inspired by personal motives. After all, it had been Ankhis and Amun who had turned against Horemheb at the most crucial moment in his pre-royal career. Thus, Horemheb finally ascended the throne for which he had been destined some 13 years before. And as if to prove that his claim to the throne had been a legitimate one, because he had been given the offices of Iripat of Upper and Lower Egypt and deputy of the king in the entire land, he gave these very same titles to his own future successor, his vizier Paramessu, who was to become Ramesses I. Thank you very much.
Well, now we know more about the pre-royal career of Haremhab. Our next speaker is Dorothea Arnold, who is the Lila Atchison Wallace Chairman of the Department of Egyptian Art. As I mentioned before, she is the one who organized the exhibition across the hall. She said, only mention that particular detail, but I also want to mention that last fall, many of you will have seen another special exhibition, which was in our special gallery, which was Tutankhamun's funeral, which is also of the same period. We have a number of pieces that come from a cache of material that was used during the burial of Tutankhamun. And that exhibition had beautiful garlands and various other materials that were used, and no doubt at the ceremony that was overseen by I after Tutankhamun's death. Dr. Arnold's topic today is going to be the Metropolitan Museum statue of Horemheb and the god Thoth. So please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Dorothea Arnold.
Thank you, and hello to this interesting symposium. After we have now had such a marvelous historical reconstruction, we are just shifting the approach, the viewpoint. And by looking more with the eyes of, may I say, an art historian on the statue, and see what that statue tells us about maybe also the man and the understanding as a commissioner of that masterpiece. The first question, of course, when you approach this masterpiece of our collection, now in the center of the gallery, first question is, of course, how do we get in Egyptian art history from here on the left to this statue on the right? On the left is, of course, the famous Louvre scribe, the scribe statue of ancient Egypt in the Louvre, Dynasty 4, 1,200 years older than this. That's the Egyptian culture, keeping on for over 1,000 years with the same fundamental idea of doing the statue of an intellectual and administrator. And of course, in its way, this Louvre scribe, as we all know, is sort of perfect in itself. And you should have the feeling that what can you do after that to the theme? Well, they did. They kept on. And these more than 1,000 years later, we have this statue. Let's just look at some points of difference. One is, of course, that Horemheb leans forward towards the papyrus on his lap. But that, again, I have to say, is Old Kingdom. We have in our collection a medium quality piece of the Old Kingdom, a scribe, Nikare, who is also already leaning forward. So that difference doesn't lead us very far. Although, of course, the way this Haremhab statue leans forward has this added expression if you compare it with the earlier version. We may come back to that later. Now, in the time, one generation before Haremhab, as we just now heard, we have the important reign, art historically so important reign, of Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaten. And at that time, we have these important personalities. And one of them was the famous Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who was the wise man of the reign. He was also a scribe, and he had all sorts of other titles. But his depictions that are best known show him as a scribe. Here on the left, the one in the Luxor Museum from Karnak. And again, it's a kind of iconic way to show this genre, this intellectual, as he sits on the ground with the cross legs and the papyrus on the lap, as people used to do in old times and in many cultures. But one great difference from Haremhab is that this statue of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, looks back into the past. It is a kind of redoing a kind of going back to the impressions of statues of the Middle Kingdom. To the right here is a statue also from Karnak that was done for the vizier of Senwosret I at the beginning of the second millennium, at the beginning of the 12th dynasty. And it's quite clear that the people who commissioned and designed the statue of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, they knew about this, and they wanted actually to indicate our wise man is like the wise man of this classical period. So the statue looks back. On the other hand, Haremhab's statue, with its outfit, with its garments and wig, says, here and now, we live now, we are people of today. So I am clothed here in the garment of today. I come to you as you could see me when I appeared as the deputy of the king and the chief of the army. This also has a kind of forerunner at the time of Amenhotep III in the statue, for instance, on the left, which comes from the Ptah temple in Memphis, is now in Oxford, and was found by Petrie at that place. Long inscription, important vizier of Amenhotep III, who did all sorts of buildings about which he talks in the inscription. And as you can see, this statue already showed the subject in the clothes of today. Now we have just now the opportunity by an article just to appear by Marianne Eaton-Krauss, our great colleague in art history, about the development of this kind of garment. I can show it to you briefly, and it's also briefly shown in the exhibition. On the left up here, you have one of these tunics that we find as real pieces. They consist of a piece of cloth that is folded over, and then you have the opening here for the neck. You see the neck opening also in the statue of Haremhab. And in the middle of the dynasty 18, you see, as here in this painting of that time, it is also in the exhibition, it's from a tomb of a man called Sobek Hotep. You see that the overfall of the tunic at the sides, of that piece of cloth at the sides, can look like sleeves. They're not real sleeves, but they look like, make the impression of sleeves. And in the middle of the dynasty 18, these sleeves are straight. And then in the reign of Amenhotep III, as you see here in the statuette, we start to have some creases, which we also saw just in the statue in Oxford that you saw on the left. So we have a history, middle of dynasty 18, we have the straight sleeves. Amenhotep III, we get some pleats. And then in the Amarna period and after, as here in this group from perhaps Gebelein, and then the relief that comes from the Saqqara tomb, about which we have heard so much just now, you see that the sleeves are not only longer and have more pleats, but they're also kind of starched, so they stand out. And that is what we have in the statue. And so we really can say, from the garment point of view, this man shows himself here and now. And if you go then to the wig, you see here it's a special kind of wig, and that again appears in the tomb at Saqqara again and again, and especially with the scribes and the administrators of that appear here together with prisoners and so on. And the little shabti that is in our collection, you see here in the center, is actually inscribed for a scribe of recruits. So it is possible that this was a wig type that was especially fashionable among army scribes. So again, we have this here and now aspect in the statue. So then we have that famous inscription, which our photo studio was so skillful in making us now see as one inscription, although it is on the papyrus that folds over on the leg of the statue and is actually quite difficult to read when you are there. So we have now this beautiful new way to study the inscription. The inscription, as you all know, is a hymn, a longish hymn to the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, the god of writing, the god of the moon, calculation, and then the gods who also is very important on your way to the afterlife. I'm just giving you here the last paragraph of that inscription in the translation of Jim Allen. And you see here it says, "Let us praise Thoth, the accurate plummet in the balance." That's the plummet on which your heart is weighed at the last judgment. "Who rejects disorder and accepts the one who is not inclined to transgression, the vizier who judges affairs, who resolves conflicts peacefully." The whole hymn text is so structured that it shows that Thoth is the vizier of this supreme solar god Re. And of course, the meaning behind it is that Haremhab sees his own tasks, his own job as the deputy of the king in parallel to that. So in a way, he puts himself into a parallel place to the god. And in that way also gives himself a place in, you can say, the universe. So he sees all this in one totality. And it's shown like that through the inscription. Now, if we go on from this duality in this statue, we see a man of here and now, and we have this kind of hinting, rather impressive hint through the text, that there is a close relationship here to Thoth. What comes up immediately to us, knowing Egyptian pieces, and must have come up to the knowledgeable people of the time, and so to the commissioner and the designer of the statue, was a type of small statuettes in groups that were quite numerous in the time, again, from the middle of Dynasty 18 to the Amarna period. Some, as we will hear in a minute, are even found at Amarna. So one of these small groups from the Louvre, we're happy to have as a loan, so it's also in the exhibition. It's a beautiful piece. It shows, of course, the scribe in the same attitude, and then it shows the baboon of Thoth, one of the animals in which the god is shown, on a shrine, seated side by side. It's one of the very few examples where a god and a non-royal mortal are shown so close together. In a way, you can do like that, and you can say, here is the scribe, and with the hymn, here is the Thoth. And one has the true feeling that that was known, as I say, to the commissioner and the knowledgeable who saw the statue. So let us go a bit. I was immediately very taken by these little groups when we thought about all that. And I have to say, what I'm mentioning here in remarks really is the outcome of discussions I've had with the colleagues, especially Marsha Hill, while we did the exhibition and while it was now on. This is the great thing of doing these small exhibitions of your own collection, that you can really concentrate on trying to understand better one of the masterpieces. And one is so grateful for that. So here you see 4 of these little groups that are completely preserved. We have the group you just saw now, made for a man called Merutef in the Louvre, and the one in alabaster here is for the same man, also in the Louvre. We have another group in Berlin here, and we have a group on the left. The right one is the Berlin one, and the group on the left, which is no inscription, which is in Cairo, or I must say was in Cairo because it's among the stolen objects, recently disappeared objects, which comes from Amarna. And then beside that, There are preserved a number of just described figures, but come clearly also from groups like that. For instance, the left one, very left one, which is in our collection, if you turn it around, it has a hole drilled, and that hole was meant to have a peg, and with the peg, the figure set on that base. And the same is true for the other two. The center one is again in Berlin, and the right one here is in Detroit. These two have the one leg slightly up, but also a papyrus on the lap, even in this oblique position, and that is like we have it in the second piece in the Louvre group. So all this is a very small, kind of a closely related group of high-quality objects. Now, if you look a little bit and remember what we just said about the dating of the garment, you see our group, our scribe here, our loose scribe here on the very left up would be comparable to the statue in Luxor of Amenhotep, son of Hapu. It usually is even dated slightly earlier, maybe even under Thutmose IV. I will not go into the details here of the week and so on. That has to be done, I must say. And then the piece in, this is the piece from Detroit, would have the same kind of initial starting pleats like the statue in Oxford from the time of Amenhotep III, and we do not really have one of them exactly like the garment from the time of Amarna and after, which lets you pause what about the dates? We will come back later because, as I told you, there are two of these groups found in Amarna. So a second point to make on these groups is their size. As you can see here, the group we have from the Louvre in the exhibition is about 7 inches, something over 7 inches high. So it's about this one. Now, what about small pieces like that? There's a very interesting and moving example from a find of the early 18th dynasty made by the combined excavations, pre-Tutankhamun excavations of Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter. And you see this specific find group here on the left in that large photo. There is the outfit of a scribe. We have, I should really try to use this here. So we have here a scribe palette, we have something for the ink, we have the reeds to write, we have the folder for the reeds. So all this fits as the outfit of a scribe. And here is the little baboon figure, which apparently was found, they say, in a basket. So I'm not sure, is this the basket, or it must have maybe a larger basket. It was found together with all this, wrapped up in a little piece of cloth. So clearly it was treasured, and it was part of the scribal outfit. A very intimate relationship between here a simple scribe, pretty simple scribe, and the god Thoth in his figure as a baboon. And this reminds one, of course, small, the figure is like that, maybe 2 inches. This reminds one, of course, of small figures of the simple kind that are found in houses, for instance in Amarna, and we always rightly associate them with the intimate piety and the intimate thoughts of the people who live there, people like you and me, you know. So here, for instance, are some kind of middle-class houses, Amarna, and these are some of the objects you would find here. So here's the head of a Hathor, a goddess. Here are 2 snakes, renanuted, and here is a little monkey. And this is the kind of figures you would find, which are the same kind of thing as you have here in the outfit of the scribe. Personal, intimate, simple, small. Now, our small groups, of course, are different in as being high art. They must have been commissioned by people with a lot of means. So we go perhaps over to another kind of small images. that are more in that class, in the class of where you employ the highest available artists. And that is true already also for the time of Amenhotep III. It has been remarked on by Betsy Bryan in the catalogue to the marvelous exhibition on Amenhotep III, that in that time there were especially, or there are preserved, especially many small pictures of the king and his family, small sizes. I mean, this one is about this size. This, of course, is an Akhenaton from Amarna, and I must say the observation about especially many small figures in the time of Amenhotep III is also true of the time of Akhenaton in Amarna. We have a time when apparently small figures, and it was not only during that time, small figures were in houses and with the personal possessions of people, and were also made in high quality art pieces. Intimate and direct, small. People have always said that the places where these might have been positioned would be the altars in the large houses. If you have one here, these are the steps, and then you have a little altar here. So you could take one of those figures, put it here, and say your prayers. Or associate it with your prayers, associate the king as a intermediary with your prayers. Here is one of those mansions, and it could be in there. But also to many of the mansions in Amarna, we have the attached gardens and chapels, as you see one here represented. So it is very much possible, and always thought, that these kind of royal figures were put into those kind of house close or in-house altars and praying places. But the two figures that were actually found at Amarna, we know they were found at Amarna, the two figures of our groups, do not come from high-class mansions. The group in Cairo comes from a group of houses found by the EES under Pendlebury in the 30s, found in a compound of places where people think there might have been sculptors' workshops. Unfortunately, we do not have a specific point in this group where the piece was found. And this little figure, now in Berlin, was found actually in this, what really looks like a house, maybe of one of the sculptors, and there, even below part of a wall, as if it was a foundation deposit, or it was there earlier. Anyway, the connection between these figures and the large mansions and their altars is not really there. I would therefore go further on and remind you that at Amarna we have also what is usually called private chapels. Some of them are clustered here around a corner of the workman's village. They have been studied, of course, by Barry Kemp, and we also owe to him this exact drawing of what he found in this kind of micro-archaeology where he is so great. And what he gave us was a view on these main shrines here, direct what he saw. So we have the little shrines, and in the shrines we have these benches, and you see that here, and on the benches you have scratches. So clearly people who maybe came together here as a community, we have the seating arrangements here, sitting arrangements for communities, they came together, they also brought objects, put them there, and took them away also. So we get this kind of movement of objects. And from there, I would like to remind you that the small object is a very important thing in human culture, everywhere, from the very earliest times till today, because you can have it in your hand. Here you see the two gloved hands of Diana Patch carrying one of our pre-dynastic little female figures. And you can see how well the figure fits into the hand. And what is happening here, of course, is that you take an object and you do something with it. The anthropologists have found a marvelous expression for that. They call it material vehicle, because what you can do is, as a human being, you can take the small objects and express something that is beyond you. You can make a communication to the beyond, be it divine or be it dead, the world of the dead. So with these scratches on these benches and the idea that small pieces are really therefore to be moved, to be given, and then maybe taken away and put in your house, and whatever you do after that, maybe in the end let it end up in a grave, it seems to explain the function of also, or something of the function of the small groups. So we have intimacy, we have a willingness to do something with it in a pious way and to get from your own material world somewhere else by giving and taking. Now, there's another point to these groups, which I have come up very much in a discussion between me and Marsha Hill, is the fact that most of them, except for one, and I don't want to go into that detail now, but most of them show the god and the man in a rectangular position. So you have the god like that, and you have the man like that. It has been said that this is because he has his ear here, so to speak, to the god. So he writes what the god tells him into his ear. But I think if we put this into an art historical, we look at it in an art historical way, we have to remember that in ancient Egypt, there is one kind of representation that is always at right angles, and that is the representation of the parent and the child. For instance, in Brooklyn, the queen and her son, the king, queen regent. And later you have it very often with the tutor or the nurse and the child. So you have that relationship that you have between parent, teacher, and son or daughter, descendant. And there we, of course, remember that in the scribe world, it was so important who was your teacher. The teacher saw himself, we know that from many texts, saw himself as the father of his student, of the next scribe. You have this idea that the scribal knowledge comes down from generation to generation. So I have a feeling that that kind of thing, that kind of aspect would be there too for the ones who were knowledgeable in how Egyptian art expressed, what Egyptian art expressed with its structures and images. And of course, then we also remember that in the Amarna chapels, one has often talked about ancestor worship. That in these chapels, what went on was perhaps in part, or mainly, a kind of ancestor worship, worship of the dead, with whom we want to make a connection for the community. So maybe this explains why at least those two pieces that come from Amarna, surely, maybe some of the others too, were perhaps, I think, made earlier than Amarna. In other words, they were taken to Amarna for a certain purpose. Maybe by scribes who wanted to take their teacher, the god, with them. So all this, when you look at the statue, somehow this reverberates in the back, I think. And there's something else, I think, that reverberates in looking at these small groups. that there is something involved that I call setting. And what you have here is the Louvre group, and you see the base, and the base has these cavities, and each piece is set into the cavity. This goes back even to a very much older example, and this is an Old Kingdom piece also in the Louvre, where we have a large plate with an offering formula, and the smaller scribe figure is set in here. You could, of course, say, well, it was easier to make like that. You can always say things like that. Even then, you will ask yourself, of course, why were they able to make this altar piece here, one with the base? Or why then not the others? So then I remember that in the Middle Kingdom, we have also groups that set one piece in another. And this is here, for instance, from Liszt, from a tomb, found at the mouth of a tomb. There is an offering plate here with the usual offerings. And then there is the figure here, not really of a scribe, but in a pretty close way to represent the person. And of course, again, you think about setting. Now it should do it. It was meant to come down into the piece. Here it does it now. There it is. It didn't work immediately, but it worked. Huh? Anyway, you see the idea. The idea that something is done here. And what is it? This is ritual. If we look at Egyptian rituals, in the texts at least, we have again and again the description of parts of a setting. For instance, the priest in the daily ritual, he provides the fire, and he brings the arm for the incense. He puts the brazier on. Next step, he puts the incense in. He puts the fire on, and then he presents it. So this kind of setting is ritual. And I wonder whether that isn't also behind the statue. That we have this intimacy, we have the idea that you give something and that you have received from your teacher, that you keep in contact with that, and that this whole thing is really a ritual which goes on in a temple. And from there, I think we come back to our Amenhotep, son of Hapu statues, as they were found at the pylon number 10, built by Haremhab, here right off the entry. So you came in here this is the entry, and to your right, you had this huge colossal of Haremhab with his wife, the queen, and along them you had the two statues of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and then two statues of the future Ramses I as a vizier. Now, of course, for one thing, this setting cannot be contemporary because the two statues are earlier than this whole pylon. So somebody must later even have, maybe intentionally, to enhance perhaps the two Ramses statues here. He put the older ones of the wise men of the generation before with them. We don't know, but there could be something going on like that. The main thing is that the inscription on these two statues state explicitly to the one who enters the precinct here, the divine precinct, if you want something from the god, come to me first because I am your mediary. And if we think now about the intimacy and this kind of combination of giving and taking that we saw, and then the ritual character of it that may be behind our Haremhab, it comes into that same realm of seeing the scribe as somebody who is not only close to the gods or even parallels the god in his work, but is also possible for him to mediate between the people and the gods. Now, the big question here, of course, that we have also discussed is, did Haremhab, if he commissioned it like that, and they put all this thought behind it, did he mean it? Was it serious? Or did he use it because he wanted to get on? We don't know, of course, and frankly, with politicians, you can't tell. But even if it was to a great extent used, if you use beliefs, the beliefs have to be real. So it doesn't take away, I think, from all that you see behind here in saying, well, this was a politician. Now, there is one point I have to confess in this statue, which to me looks very much political and very much sort of over the top in that sense. And that is the incision on his arm. Here on this arm, just preserved from the hacking off of the hand, is an incised figure of Amun, the god of Karnak. Now, as you know, this was the god that was reinstated under Haremhab. It had been really intensively persecuted under Akhenaton, and now he came back and was the supreme god again. But not at Memphis. He plays no role in these inscriptions otherwise. It's sort of additional. It's sort of, as I say, on top of it. So in a way, one wants to say, come on. Anyway, with that, I would like to say these were some remarks on the statue. Thank you.
Well, having heard an interpretation of the statue and its meaning, we are now going to go on to our third speaker, who is Orly Goldwasser, who's professor and chair of Egyptology at the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She's also honorary professor in the University of Göttingen. She is a specialist in Egyptian language, and she is particularly interested in the semiotics of Egyptian hieroglyphs, which is the study of the symbols themselves. And it's a way of trying to use the way Egyptians decided to write down their language to interpret their way of thinking. She described it yesterday to me as a sort of archaeology of the mind, which I thought was a very apt description. She came here last year as our Wilkinson lecturer, and she spoke to us about the genesis of the alphabet through Egyptian hieroglyphs. And in her lecture today, she asks a question, which is, what does the script teach us? The dream of Haremhab. So please, won't you welcome Professor Orly Goldwasser.
It's a little bit hard to talk on power and other prosaic things after this wonderful, touching lecture of Dorothea Arnold, and I just want to say I'm very grateful for this invitation to talk here, and I'm also very grateful to all the very kind members of this wonderful department, so vivid and creative, that helped me a lot during the preparation of this little lecture. The personal aspirations, feelings, and sorrows of the rulers who forged the history of ancient Egypt are mostly hidden from the sight for the modern spectator. Royal texts of the 18th dynasty and texts of high officials obey strict conventions of contents and language. Horemheb, the hero of this conference, is not an exception to this pattern. The Egyptian texts give us only landmarks in his career: a military scribe, overseer of the scribes, hereditary prince, fan bearer on the right side of the king, chief commander of the army, king's messenger, a deputy of the king, all of that we have seen, but, and finally, a self-crowned pharaoh. During the time he served under Tutankhamun, Haremheb built an opulent tomb in Memphis which we saw in the lecture of Professor Van Dyck, which teaches us of his importance and power during the reign of Tutankhamun. Yet it is still definitely a non-royal tomb, a tomb of a civil servant who had reached the highest echelons of power in his days. During this whole period, the Memphite tomb, and in the Memphite tomb and in other known inscriptions, his name is written without a cartouche, and it gets a classifier of a nobleman. Here's an example from one of the statue, and you see the name of Horemheb written here, and this sign is not to be read. It's only a picture that says to us this is an important man, because you see he sits on a chair. Common people would sit on the ground. We will see this later, and this is called generally in Egyptology a determinative, and I call them classifiers. The Egyptian writing system includes a very sophisticated system of classifiers that are mute, unpronounced hieroglyphs that appear almost after every word in the lexicon, relating the word to a certain category in the ancient Egyptian culture and mind. Tutankhamun died very early. After being enthroned at 9 years old, he died unexpectedly at only about 18 years old. Into this power vacuum enters the elderly I, which we heard of this morning, who becomes pharaoh for the next 4 years. When I dies, Horemheb, obviously the most powerful in Egypt, or the most powerful man in Egypt, is still not a pharaoh. But why did Horemheb let I take the throne when he was already, by the death of Tutankhamun, the strong man of Egypt? Was he constrained by his modest origin, or, as it was suggested here before, he was absent at the crucial moment, engaged in a war campaign in Syria? But how did he feel about it? What were his relations with I? Did they strike a deal? When did he really start to toy with the idea that he should be the king? As I said before, Egyptian texts never tell us about feelings or aspirations. Modern historians fill the gaps between the landmark facts with colorful sentences, such as Horemheb was probably very angry and frustrated when I seized the throne after the end. Needless to say, nowhere in the Egyptian sources do we find any information of this sort. Nor do the texts tell us when did Horemheb, a man who for a long time saw himself probably only as a high-ranking official of the king, as we could understand from his long investment in his non-royal tomb at Memphis, when does he start to get the idea that he should be the king? My claim in this lecture is that the choice piece of the exhibition just behind these doors, the statue of Horemheb the scribe, hides amongst its many hieroglyphs written around the base, not the papyrus that Dorothea was talking about, covert information about the secret aspirations of Horemheb. The Metropolitan statue of Horemheb is a masterpiece of Egyptian art, and we understood it perfectly why and how now. And however, it is also a construct of different semiotic meanings and allusions, of which I will discuss here only one. 3 life-size statues of Horemheb as a scribe are known to date. All of them belong to his pre-royal era. In all of them, his name still appears in this non-royal version that we saw before. All 3 statues carry inscriptions on the papyri and on the base. However, the Metropolitan statue is not only by far the best preserved, but its inscriptions on the base seem to be the longer, very carefully and successfully fitted in the given space. Now we will have a look. I can not see it very well from this point, but the inscription around the base is very, very sophisticated. It starts in the middle with an ankh, and it runs in two directions. It meets at the back of the statue, and the inscription comes back again to the second line here, if you see. And if you could see here the two hairs that look at each other, one part of this inscriptions runs to this side again, and the other one to this side. You could see, I would like to thank here Gustavo Camps for these fantastic pictures that enable me to talk so nicely about this marvelous sculpture. You see the close-up. I cannot talk about everything here now again. This is an important point just to show how excellently the statue was done. Is here the fact this is the back of the statue, and you see here the name of Horemheb, which you know already by heart probably, meets the two names meet each other from both sides, and they share the Ma'acheu signs. Here. Again, another corner, you see the little leg that pops out there. Okay, this is already the second statue. This is the Cairo statue. Alas, we don't have good pictures of that. This is the second statue of this type, which is known. It was published by Hari in 1964. And here, from what I could figure out, the name is also on the back. But interestingly enough, this statue, and this is a very important point, included two cartouches of Tutankhamun, where Horemheb describes himself actually as the serving Tutankhamun. But you see the statue is in very bad shape. There's a third statue, just this, to show you that it's more or less the same arrangement as our statue. This is the third statue already, very recently published. It's a mistake by me here, it's 2010. It is badly preserved, and its inscription arrangements seem to have been simpler and shorter than the one, or even though very little is preserved, the one on the Metropolitan statue. The name of Horemheb, what is interesting, the name of Horemheb appears on the front part of the statue, based following the tradition of the older models, like here you see, or you don't see, it's again the name of Horemheb with his classifier. But this is Amenophis, son of Hapu, that was introduced to us in the lecture of Dorothea Arnold. And if we make a zoom here, we will see that his name appears in the front. So the Metropolitan statue is surely the most fully realized example known to date of the statue of Horemheb as described. And what is very important is that it does not mention a royal name. The king is not referred at all, and he is mentioned only en passant as my lord twice. Because of the conspicuous absence of the royal name, Robert Hari has dated this statue to the reign of King Ai. Hari suggested, as we heard today, that Horemheb, again, this is a suggestion, that he was unhappy, to say the least, with the rule of Ai at a certain point, and just refrained from mentioning his names. But what does the Metropolitan inscription hide? Does it hide any addition covert information about the aspiration and feeling or wishes of Horemheb at this point of his career? While the inscription of the papyrus on the lap of the scribe carries a hymn to Thoth, the inscriptions around the base is a personal inscription of the Haremhab related in first person singular. You must excuse me. It tells us in flowery conventional phrases of the excellent qualities and services of Horemheb and of his hope to be rewarded by the gods in the afterlife for his behavior. Yet I believe that Horemheb has also some very specific aspirations for his earthly life, not only for the afterlife hidden in this inscription. In order to deal with this assumption, we must learn some facts about the hieroglyphic script, and I hope you will follow me here. In 97% of the languages, not the scripts of the world, the first-person singular pronouns show no gender or status markers. When I say I, when I talk in speech, I'm here, and you can see me, identify my gender, and in many cases also my class. But what happens in the written language? Should I write my biography, for example, and I write I am not there anymore, and there is no clue to my gender or status within the first person written pronoun I. As the ancient Egyptian language, like English and like most languages of the world, use the same pronoun for all genders and status variations of the first person in the spoken language, the Egyptian used the pictorial character of the hieroglyphic script to correct this shortcoming by applying pictorial classifiers for the first person pronoun. Here you see the very simple phrase "I give," and see this hand that holds a bread, probably is the symbol of giving, is the verb to give, and these are actually 6 or 7 options here to write in Egyptian I give by revealing by the classifier the gender of the speaker. It's all I give, but when you read it, you see that this is a simple man, and this is a woman, and this is a god, and this is also a god, another prototypical anthropomorphic god, and this is the king with the rose, and this is the nobleman like Horemheb. And this is a very interesting variation. This is a variation that actually has no classifier. It just writes phonetically the pronunciation of the little phrase "I give." D-E. This is E. The first person in this kind of first person pronoun in Egyptian is pronounced E, a little bit like in Hebrew. We know it also in Hebrew. If I write if I take this version, to write this little phrase phonetically, in this case, the hand giving the bread is the writing for give, and the first person pronoun is a read, a phonetic representation of E. You read it E. And then we can read it as a ready E. Here, in this kind of spelling, there is no additional information in the script concerning the speaker's gender or status, man, woman, god, or king. However, in most cases, the Egyptian script, and we shouldn't forget the script alone, gives us this additional information. Instead of writing the read, the script gives us the classifier for first person, which is, of course, mute hieroglyphs, and I said before. It gives us a gender specification. It could be female, divine, or status specification, nobleman, or king. just to remind us, the dignitary here and the king. Queen Hatshepsut, an Egyptian royal of the 18th dynasty, who is marvelously represented again in this fantastic collection of the Metropolitan Museum, has severe self-representation problems. Being a female playing a role of a male pharaoh, she constantly struggled with problems of self-representation. The Egyptian statuary and pictorial conventions were a constant challenge for her, male, female, or else. You can check all that later in the collection. The picture classifier system of the script also demanded constant decisions from Hatshepsut. Am I male, female, king, god, goddesses? And there is no real hieroglyph for a queen. In the first-person self-presentation of Hatshepsut in the script, she made some clear choices, and we will have a look at one example. This is a famous inscription of her. So in the first very official part, she does this, which means she writes the first person, you see, with the classifier of the king. She represents herself as a king. Sometimes she also chooses to represent herself with the divine classifier as a god. But if we continue to read the inscription, we see something different, that she uses what I call this non-committal read, the phonetic representation that actually tells us nothing about gender or status, exactly probably for this reason, because she doesn't want to make the choice, what am I, in this case. Another beautiful example from this period is, again, this is from the period of Hatshepsut, from the Al-Bahri, as you see, and it is a very touching scene of the cow goddess licking very gently the hand of the queen, and the cow goddess speaks to the queen. The cow also have some problems of self-presentations with these options of hieroglyphs that I showed you before. She is not a nobleman, and she has problems. So what she does is this. Describe the right for her. When she says, you are suckling from my breast, you see here the word breast, with the classifier of the breast, and then the non-committal leaf, and then when she talks on my milk, also the milk classifier and the non-committal. The cow doesn't want to commit herself to anything either. If we go back now to Horemheb, in all of his inscription until he takes the throne, he uses the conventional first-person classifier typical of men of his status, either the seated man or the seated nobleman. You should forgive the computer, not me, of course, of the situation here. Some other thing meant to be written here. But it's here you see Horemheb would take the male or the dignitary normally to represent himself before he became king. Yet there is one conspicuous exception to this rule, the Metropolitan scribe statue. If we look at the biographical text on the base of the statue, and this is the old copy of the arranged by Winlow, on the text on the base of the statue, we see that in most cases, when Haremhab uses the first-person classifiers as subject or even as object, he uses the non-committal read. I'll just give you an example. Again, here. There is nothing that I don't know or didn't know. The I is written with the leaf. And there another pronoun, I, written with the little stroke, when he says something in my mouth, this is the picture of the mouth, again the non-committal phonetic leaf. It goes on through the whole inscription besides very few examples that do not agree with that. In half of the cases, he uses even a more the minimalized, non-referential sign to represent this stroke. It's just a short stroke, and it has no iconic meaning whatsoever. Like Hatshepsut, he shies away from self-identification in gender or status in this beautiful statue. Everything is left open. Why would Horemheb turn to a long-forgotten tradition of the 18th dynasty, leaping over the Amarna period? In the Amarna time, the use of this non-committal reed for the first person is practically unknown. His educated viewer, who was familiar with this cultural register, would firstly recognize in this very unusual paleographic use of a reference to the great legitimate royals of the earlier 18th dynasty. Secondly, and more importantly, if indeed the dating of the statue is correct and it belongs to the reign of Ai because there is no king mentioned, we would see that Haremheb has already a clear plan or defined dream. I would like to suggest that he uses the non-committal writing of the first person with the reed because he does not wish to commit himself on this choice self-representation statue to the hieroglyph of a simple man or even a nobleman. When this statue is produced, probably sometimes after the death of Tutankhamun, Haremheb may already have said to himself, I should be the king, or better, I shall be Pharaoh. He probably hopes that in a short while he will be able to use as a pharaoh the royal or the divine first-person hieroglyphs like Hatshepsut did and all the other kings did. And indeed, after he realizes his dream and became a king, he never used again the non-committal reed or non-committal stroke as in this inscription. Thank you very much. I just want to, it doesn't go on. Oh. Just a tiny remark. He was a man of all seasons and a politician, and he diversified his investments in the god. So he also has the Aten still in his tomb, hiding, hearing the word light or shine. And there is another example in his tomb for the word Aten, for the sign of the god Aten, twice as classifiers. This is the word raise. It appears twice. This is the forbidden sign, the sign of the Aten that will never appear again, as far as I know, after this period in any Egyptian inscription. Thank you.
My name's Catherine Rarig. I'm one of the curators in the Department of Egyptian Art here at the Metropolitan Museum. And I'd like to welcome you to the second half of our symposium on the Haremhab, the general who became king. This symposium has been organized in conjunction with our special exhibition, which is across the hall in our special exhibition gallery. And if you haven't seen it, we hope you will. Again, for those of you who weren't here this morning, Haremhab is an important king because he is a transitional character in between two great dynasties of the New Kingdom. He comes at the very end of the 18th dynasty, and he appoints the king who becomes the beginning of the 19th dynasty, Ramses I. And as I mentioned this morning, I find it very interesting that he starts his career as we know him under Tutankhamun, and he appoints the grandfather of Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, and he undoubtedly knew Ramses. So this one man knew both of the kings that are probably the most famous kings to people in modern times. This afternoon we have 3 lectures, and we were scheduled to have a discussion of half an hour, but we've decided to skip the discussion and just go on to the conclusions. And after everything is finished, if any of you have specific questions for any of the speakers, they will be here for a few minutes and you can come down to the front and talk to them. We have to be out of the space by a certain time because there's another program going on. Our first speaker of this afternoon is Martin Raven, who was curator of the Egyptian collection in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden in the Netherlands. He is also the director of the excavations that the museum conducts at the site of Saqqara, which is just south of Giza. And he has been, among other things, one of the principal investigators of the tomb of Haremhab before he became king. But the tomb was also worked on after Haremhab became king. His topic for us today is the Memphite tomb of Haremhab, the recent discoveries. So please, won't you welcome Dr. Martin Raven.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the first place, I would like to thank my colleagues of the Metropolitan Museum of Art for organizing this symposium, and you for giving it the attention it deserves. Pharaoh Horemheb was one of the more underestimated monarchs of the Egyptian New Kingdom. After all, the smooth transition from the political and religious crisis of the Amarna period to the orthodoxy and strong kingship of the Ramessides is largely due to his person. As generalissimo of the Egyptian armies and Tutankhamun's deputy, he restored order in the foreign dominions of Asia and Nubia. Together with the acting Minister of the Interior, Maya, he may have been largely responsible for the king's peaceful return to polytheism. When, after the successive deaths of Tutankhamun and Ai, he finally managed to become pharaoh himself, Horemheb continued his policy of consolidation and restoration. He even managed to overcome the potential problem that there was no heir to the throne by transferring the power to one of his comrades in arms, the future Ramses I. Thus, Horemheb played a pivotal role in the transition from the 18th to the 19th dynasty and was justly honored as founding father of the new royal line by the Ramessides. Part of this story is written in the monumental tomb which Horemheb constructed for himself near the Egyptian capital of Memphis while still a general. The monument is situated in a then fashionable part of the vast city cemeteries which stretch for miles along the edge of the Western Desert. This particular portion of the necropolis is situated closest to the modern village of Saqqara. And it was soon covered by the freestanding structures of the private mortuary temples of the highest officials of the empire. Horemheb's tomb was one of them. And like the other structures, it soon became covered by drift sand when the cemetery fell into disuse in the course of the Ramesside period. The New Kingdom cemetery of Saqqara was first discovered by art robbers at the beginning of the 19th century. Hundreds of statues, wall reliefs, and architectural fragments were then removed from the superstructures of the tombs, whereas papyri, items of jewelry, and other funerary gifts were taken from the rock-cut burial chambers, which are generally located under the cult chapels of these tombs. The spoils ended up in the hands of a dozen private collectors and middlemen, who in their turn sold these art treasures to museums all over the world. Unfortunately, all links with the archaeological context for these museum objects were severed due to the negligence of the first discoverers, who failed to make a record of their finds. Thus, the reconstruction of the exact provenance of these priceless objects became a challenge to modern archaeology as it developed in Egypt from about 1850 onwards. Today, more than 20 expeditions are active in the greater Saqqara area, and inevitably this led to the rediscovery of the New Kingdom Cemetery in 1975. Just, where is the pointer? Sorry. Just here. In that year, a joint mission of the Leiden Museum of Antiquities, the Netherlands, and the Egypt Exploration Society, based in London, directed by Professor Geoffrey Martin, who is present here today, started the search for the tomb of Maya, Tutankhamun's treasurer and minister of the interior. The glorious tomb statues of Maya and his wife Merit have been in the collections of the Leiden Museum ever since 1829. 15 years after their acquisition, in 1843, the German scholar Richard Lepsius still saw the plundered remains of Maya's tomb jutting out of the desert at Saqqara and noted their position on a sketch map of the area before they disappeared again under drift sand. Armed with this map, the Anglo-Dutch expedition started work at Saqqara in January 1975. Within a week, we could broadcast that the long-lost New Kingdom Cemetery of Saqqara had been relocated. The only problem was that the monument found did not belong to Maya, but to his contemporary, the Generalissimo Horemheb. Clearly, Lepsius' map was not very accurate. Under the circumstances, there was no reason to complain. Clearly, Horemheb was even more interesting than his contemporary Maya, because of his later career as a pharaoh. Secondly, the tomb proved to be exceptionally well preserved, both from an architectural point of view as with regard to its wall decorations. The mud brick monument still contains a fair proportion of its original limestone reliefs and inscriptions, which is all the more remarkable because no less than 14 museums in the world can boast that they own parts of these in their collections. One of these is the Leiden Museum, which possesses parts of two relief scenes, one showing the general's reward after his victorious return from the battlefield. Sorry, this one. Here you see the reward scene and a detail. The other scene represents a conversation between Horemheb and his master Tutankhamun, whose words are then repeated by an interpreter to the foreign envoys. As the excavations unfolded, the Leiden scenes proved to have been part of the decoration in the tomb's inner courtyard. After a thorough inspection of the underground burial apartments, the Anglo-Dutch expedition provisionally restored and consolidated Horemheb's monument, and casts of the Leiden reliefs and other scenes were put back in their original positions on the walls. The final reports on the fieldwork appeared in 4 volumes, published by the Egypt Exploration Society between 1989 and 2008. Together, these 4 books cover all aspects of our discoveries, from the architecture and wall decoration to the sculptures and small objects, the pottery, and the skeletal remains. One would think that after this, nothing remains to be said about the Memphite tomb of Horemheb. However, in the meantime, the excavations at Saqqara have continued with the clearance of other New Kingdom tombs, and I'm happy to say that these include that of Maya, discovered in 1986. The Egypt Exploration Society withdrew in 1998, so that now the expedition is a partnership between the Leiden Museum and Leiden University, and I have become its field director. Nobody could have foreseen that Horemheb's tomb would have to be revisited by our team. We had known for years, of course, that the plan of Horemheb's tomb as published in the book by Geoffrey Martin was incomplete. With a total length of 45 meters and a succession of 2 peristyle courtyards, the outer and inner one, each followed by a row of cult chapels, the tomb constitutes a reduplication of the contemporary type and is in fact almost twice as long as usual. Even so, we remembered that in 1975 we had seen a stretch of pavement extending in front of the tomb's limestone entrance pylon. This is not indicated in the published plan, though visible in some of the book's illustrations. At the time of excavation, further progress eastwards was not deemed wise because we would risk to uncover the remains of an adjacent tomb. Also, we were rather discouraged by the considerable height of the debris, here, accumulated over this area. Further exploration was postponed, then forgotten as more urgent tasks awaited us elsewhere on the site. Later, this forecourt was used as a temporary dump by our workmen, so that the pavement had long disappeared from view again. From the single tomb of Horemheb, the excavation site has now grown into a city of no less than 15 tombs. While working around the newly found monument of Mary Neath in 2003, we suddenly hit a mud brick wall which ran parallel to Horemheb's pylon and showed a gap in line with the tomb's main axis. We soon suspected that the new wall might belong to a hitherto unknown first pylon of Horemheb's tomb, so that the intervening space, separating it from the known limestone pylon, would then form a third interior courtyard. Accordingly, during our seasons 2004 and 2005, we moved the workmen to this area and rapidly cleared a large courtyard paved in limestone. It measures 15.3 meters from east to west and 17.3 meters across. It's demarcated in the north and south by mud brick walls of 75 centimeters thick. The bricks have the same size as those in the preceding first pylon, with which the walls are bonded so that they were clearly constructed as a single project. The pylon is 4 meters thick, with both wings measuring about 8 meters in length and with a present height of 3 meters 15. The entrance gateway has limestone revetment, but no decoration. The newly found constructions bring the total length of the tomb to 65 meters. A rather rare feature of the first pylon is the presence of regular openings in the brickwork. These clearly served for fixing scaffolding and may be a sign that the pylon was never finished properly. The pavement makes a rather eroded impression, as if it has lain exposed to the elements for a long period or sustained the shuffle of numerous feet. This would suggest that many visitors came to the tomb in antiquity and that the courtyard was perhaps added to accommodate them. A similar picture is presented by the numerous graffiti scratched on the revetment of the gateway. It should be noted that several of these depict royal heads or pharaohs, as if the visitors were aware that they entered a royal monument and not the tomb of a private official. The interior parts of the tomb contain several portraits of General Horemheb, which have been given a uraeus serpent on the brow by later visitors. Clearly, such additions were made after Horemheb's accession to the throne. We would suggest, therefore, that the extra pylon and forecourt were added to the previous constructions after Horemheb had become king, either by his orders or perhaps after his demise. Possibly the additions intended to transform the tomb from a private chapel to a royal mortuary temple. An extra factor which may have motivated this transition is the fact that Horemheb used his general's tomb for the burial of his queen, Mutnajmet. This is implied by the presence of a statue of the queen and other royal burial gifts in the main shaft of the tomb, already found during the 1970s. A fragmentary votive stela of the Queen with her husband came up during our recent work in the area. 2 dockets from the main shaft complex suggest that the burial of Mut-Najmet took place in Horemheb's year 13. Since the king himself died about a year later, as has been argued by Jaap van Dijk, on the basis of similar dockets from Horemheb's royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, this wouldn't have given the king much time to adapt his ancient Memphite tomb, and the constructions may have been executed already before the queen's death. One of the pieces of evidence for this presumed royal burial of Mut-Najmet was the presence in the burial chambers of a vessel fragment inscribed with the name of Queen T, presumably an heirloom from one of the royal palaces. Our team has now managed to find a joining shirt, which adds the cartouches of T's husband Amenhotep III. It was found in the dump on the tomb's forecourt, deposited and clearly overlooked by the workmen clearing the burial chambers in the 1970s. Several new relief blocks belonging to the tomb's decoration have been found after Martin's 1989 publication. One of the more interesting fragments is this block, which joins a loose slab found by the previous expedition and deriving from the tomb's central chapel. It depicts part of an offering scene before the sun god Rehorakte, and on the thickness, a figure of the rare goddess Yus-Aas. Some of the new tombs uncovered by the present-day expedition also shed new light on the genesis of Horemheb's monument. Thus, we are now able to say that he shared at least one of his sculptors with his eastern neighbor in the cemetery, the priest Mary Neath. Both tombs contain an identical, though highly unusual, depiction of a kneeling woman with elegantly curled toes. There are more of such striking similarities, also with the contemporary tomb of Maya. Turning now to the small objects, I would like to show this picture to our hosts of the Metropolitan Museum. A wooden lid found by our mission in a tomb shaft next to Horemheb's monument seems to belong to a cosmetic box which has been in the Met since 1953 and comes from the former Albert Gallatin collection. Such stray finds show the full potential of the current fieldwork for reconstructing the original find spot of items in museums. A fresh study of the evidence has also shed new light on the statuary from the Memphite tomb of Horemheb. In 1976, an intriguing fragment was found in the debris of the tomb's central chapel. Although it was correctly described in Hans Schneider's catalogue of finds as 3 hands holding each other, with some difficulty you can see that there are 3 hands involved, the full implication of such an unusual composition was not realized. What would the original statue have looked like? And do such statues occur from ancient Egypt? It was my Leiden colleague, Dr. René van Walsum, who found out that there is in fact only one such statue, that of a seated couple in the British Museum. This statue has long been considered as one of the most beautiful sculptures of the Egyptian collection in London. Due to its unfinished state, no inscriptions were added, and the owners have remained anonymous. Typologically, the statue is datable to the very end of Dynasty 18. What is unique, however, is that the husband lays one hand over those of his wife, which lie clasped in her lap. The hands themselves, though, are lost. In order to test Van Walsum's supposition that the Saqqara fragment joins the British Museum statue, we asked and received permission to make a cast of the hands. In 2009, British Museum conservator Mike Nielsen joined our team in Saqqara and made a replica of the fragment. Back in London, he could soon report that the hands make a perfect fit. This means that the British Museum statue can now be regarded as a portrait of Horemheb and his first wife Amenia, and once stood in the Saqqara tomb. For those of you who are not so easily convinced by this hands-on demonstration, there are some more arguments. Thus, the London statue compares very well with two other dyads found in Horemheb's tomb, one of which is now in the Luxor Museum. The three statues have a number of unusual details in common, such as the heavy folds of flesh under the chest, the fact that the husband is wearing sandals, and that he is depicted with visible nipples. The British Museum statue is clearly unfinished. The wig of the husband still shows a peculiar checkered pattern, which should help the sculptor to carve the undulating locks of hair. Only one other example of this feature seems to be known: statue fragment number 5, found in the Memphite tomb of Horemheb. The triangular elements forming the transition between the lower row of squares and the corkscrew curls along the edge of the wig are also remarkably identical. You can also see them here. Another feature which the London statue shares with the sculptures found in the Saqqara tomb is the intentional damage inflicted on the hands and the breasts of the wife. We can only speculate who undertook these acts of iconoclasm and when, but clearly Horemheb had enemies. This unusual feature is also seen on the anonymous statue of another seated couple in the Leiden Museum. The Leiden statue also has damaged faces, just like several of the statues found in Horemheb's tomb. The husband is depicted with the gold of honor around his neck and was clearly a very high official. Like the British Museum statue, the Leiden one was acquired from the former collections of Giovanni d'Anastasi, who was Consul General for Sweden in Alexandria. The Leiden statue also shares some unusual stylistic features with the sculptures found in the tomb. These include the lotus stems hanging down at the back of the wife's head, a detail which can also be seen on one of the damaged dyads from Saqqara. We would like to conclude that this unfinished statue in Leiden is in fact yet another portrait of Horemheb and his wife. Another statue in Leiden depicts a kneeling man with offering table. It is unfinished, has been intentionally damaged, and has several stylistic details in common with the other statues mentioned. Moreover, it is very similar to another kneeling statue found in the Memphite tomb of Horemheb. We would propose that the figure in Leiden also came from the tomb in Saqqara, and this would bring the total number of statues in that tomb to at least 13, a clear sign of the elevated social position of the general even before he became pharaoh. The new discoveries have further demonstrated that Horemheb's Memphite tomb is unique in Egypt. This consideration motivated us to preserve it for posterity. Already in the 1980s, reconstruction of the tomb's inner courtyard was made possible by a Dutch grant, whereas the Egyptians restored the outer court and second pylon. However, after 25 years in the open air, both parts displayed clear structural problems. Look at all the scaffolding. We therefore had to face the difficult task of dismantling the concrete slabs used as roofing material in the inner court. This was undertaken at the end of 2007. Instead, we installed a lightweight construction of steel beams. This carries a roof of timber, bitumen insulation, and a thin layer of white cement mortar. This is after our present restorations, and this is before. In order to prevent damage to the reliefs caused by bird droppings, The open center of the courtyard was covered by a galvanized steel mesh, and a mesh door in a steel frame was installed at the entrance to the courtyard. An extension of the roof was made to protect the shrines against the west wall of the statue chamber between the outer and inner courtyards. A similar roof was constructed above the vulnerable reliefs in the entrance to the statue chamber. In the outer courtyard, the incomplete and water-damaged reconstructed columns were completed. Finally, the pavement in the newly found forecourt was restored and the revetment of its entrance repaired. Thereby, the whole site of the Leiden excavations has now been consolidated, and information panels in English and Arabic have been installed. A new concrete pathway connects the site with the tourist part of the Saqqara Plateau, and we expect that the New Kingdom tombs will soon be open to visitors. Thereby, the Memphite tomb of Horemheb will finally get the attention it deserves. In the course of the past half hour, I have of course not been able to give you more than just a glimpse of our most recent work in the tomb. For those who want the full story, we have just published a 5th and hopefully last volume in the series of publications devoted to the Memphite tomb of Horemheb. I am ready to take your orders and can offer you a discount only today of 20% on the sales price. And otherwise, for more information, you can always consult our excavations website, www.saqqara.nl. Thank you for your attention.
What a wonderful story of a reconstruction and an identification of a statue. Our next speaker for the afternoon, let's see here, is Manfred Bietak. He was the professor emeritus of Egyptology at the University of Vienna, and he was previously the director of the Austrian Archaeological Institute in Cairo. He is currently the chairman of the Vienna Institute of Archaeological Science at the University of Vienna. He's probably best known for his excavations at the site of Tel Adaba, in the ancient city of Avaris, which was the capital of the Hyksos kings who preceded the 18th dynasty, and at the site of Per-Ramesses, which is the capital of the Ramesside kings. But today he's going to talk to us about Haremhab as a political and military strategist in the eastern Nile Delta. So please won't you welcome Professor Bietak.
First of all, I would like to thank the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Society of Isis, and in particular the Egyptian Department of Egyptian Art of the Metropolitan Museum for inviting me to speak today. We had heard today quite a lot of Horemheb as from his more central part where he lived in Memphis. I will lead you now to another part of his activities, to the northeastern Nile Delta. The Nile Delta was always a very strategic area of Egypt, particularly the eastern Delta, which was nearest to the Near East. The delta was at that time quite smaller than today. The coastline was at least 50 kilometers in a southerly position, and also the lagoons were more in a southerly position and are largely unexplored in their precise extent. What would, however, be very important for exploring the river traffic and the harbors. Ancient harbors in the delta have to be near the sea, because there is a dictate by the Nile regime which ports cannot escape. If you want to support a harbor for seagoing ships, you need the sea, because in the first part of the year, number one, January, February, there is no traffic, no navigation in the Mediterranean at all. In antiquity, we know this very well from texts, papyri from the very late period, because of winter gales, because of fog. It was dangerous to have a navigation then. But then in March, till the coming of the flood in July, there was a period of dryness in which the Nile volume receded to 1/5 of its average volume. And we know that river navigation was very difficult at the time. This small detail is overlooked by Egyptologists in general in trying to pinpoint where certain harbors had been in antiquity, particularly the famous harbor of Peru-Nefer, the major naval stronghold of Egypt in the Thutmoside period. It means that harbors had to be near the Mediterranean. Why? Because in the period of dryness, the empty Nile channels were filled with seawater, and only as far as the seawater can penetrate, you may have perennial sea harbors. The eastern delta is especially important because there the rivers have a northeasterly or east-northeasterly direction. This is an enormous advantage because in Egypt the wind blows steadily northwest, southeast, except if you have bad weather. This means you can sail and you can return under sails, half winds. You cannot have this in the western delta, where you can only enter before the wind and have to leave the delta without sails together with the Nile current. Taking this into consideration, it's very clear in the second millennium the most important zone of navigation for the Mediterranean was in the eastern part of the Nile Delta. But this implies also a danger, because enemies or pirates could enter easily and could leave easily under sails. The position of harbors in deltaic landscapes can be studied at every deltaic landscape. For instance, here in the Netherlands, you have all the famous harbors, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Brugge, between 4 and 30 kilometers from the sea. And because the sea mouths are shallow and ships can have difficulties during the ebb to leave. So to have ships protected during winter gales, you need inshore harbors. The same is true for ancient Egypt. Again, a picture of the Rhine Delta. But in Egypt, you have pretty much the same. And one of the most important harbors for some time had been at the site of Tel Daba, where I spent quite a time exploring the site. It's a strategic position. The site is positioned at the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, only 30 kilometers from the open sea. And also the Horus Road finds its way between the Pelusiac branch of the Nile and the Bahr el-Baga drainage system into the eastern delta. Well, in the course of our surveys and excavations, we discovered by geophysical survey of the Austrian Archaeological Institute and by cooperation with the University of Lyon 2, this enormous harbor basin. It's 450 to 400 meters, a huge basin with an access channel and an exit channel leading back to the Nile, with a current which kept this enormous basin free of sediments. Hundreds of ships could be moored here, and this site, just for those who are less familiar with Egyptology, is identified with the capital of the Hyksos, Awaris, and we know from texts that Awaris was a very important harbor town where hundreds of ships could be moored, and Pyramesse, the southern part of Pyramesse, and it seems that the harbor function was kept until the times of the Ramessides, until the 20th dynasty. So there's an access channel and exit channel back into the Nile. You see also that the town was situated practically on a kind of island between the Pelusiac branch and an old water branch where the water was flowing only slowly, but nevertheless this protected the site very well. And the earliest part of the town during the Middle Kingdom concentrated on both sides of this basin, which surely was in the 12th dynasty much smaller than in the time of the New Kingdom. In the Hyksos period, when this site became capital of Egypt, of the 15th dynasty, who controlled at least the northern part of Egypt, this site grew to 250 hectares, which is about 1 square mile. It was without doubt in the first half of the second millennium the biggest town in the whole eastern Mediterranean. Well, after the conquest of Awaris by Ahmose, the founder of the 18th dynasty, the founder of the New Kingdom, they choose this site to position troops here. We have, wherever we dig, we find remains of silos, big silos. This is 5 meters diameter, one of these silos. There were hundreds of such silos. And later, we found evidence of campsites, tents. Here you see campfires, and cemeteries of soldiers. Mostly men between 18 to 25 years were buried here, many of them of Nubian origin. And we have to remember that at the same time, Egypt was engaged in warfare against the kingdom of Kush, south of Egypt in the modern Sudan. South of the Third Cataract lay Kerma, the capital of the kingdom of Kush, a fierce enemy of Egypt, and it were the pharaohs Amenophis the first, Thutmosis the first, and finally Thutmosis II and Thutmosis III, who finally subdued this kingdom. And one could imagine that lots of prisoners of war had been made and sent to the north and were recruited by the Egyptian army for campaigns in the Near East. Yes, this again a picture of the site with this harbor basin, but in the very west, situated directly at the Pelusiac branch, we discovered a huge palace, a palace of royal outlines, constructed most likely by Thutmosis III and Hatshepsut in the early reign of Thutmosis III. And this palace has, this precinct had 13 acres. It's quite a big district with a big palace of 160 meters length, a smaller palace of 75 meters length, a third palace here in the south, a huge lake in between, an artificial lake, enclosure wall, an official building, and this was a spectacular sight because the palaces, at least two of the palaces, were embellished with paintings of Minoan artists. But I will not dwell on this subject here. I spoke on this at previous lectures, but it was a real amazing phenomenon to find in an Egyptian palace truly Minoan paintings in Minoan technique, in Minoan style, and with Minoan motifs like bull leaping, bull grappling, and other motifs. Well, it's, according to my opinion, no coincidence that in the British Museum papyrus 10,056, which is a dockyard document mentioning how much wood and ropes and so on had been, how much materials have been spent to repair or to build even ships. And among those ships were also Kefteu ships. This means Cretan ships, and it seems that in the time of Thutmose III, there was the biggest or the most important connection between Egypt and Crete, and even as it seems now, Cretan ships were moored in the major naval base of Egypt at the time at Pero-Nefer. And there is no doubt nowadays that this was Pero-Nefer. See the harbor, see the evidence of a palace of royal dimension, the connections with Crete, and of course the Nile regime, which dictates that harbors for seagoing ships, per-annual harbors for seagoing ships, can only be created near the sea, in the reach of the Mediterranean. Well, this Pero-Nefer was particularly the place of the crown prince Amenhotep II, who followed Thutmose III in his reign, and it was particularly Amenhotep who also very often spent his time in this harbor and used it as a base for his campaigns in the Near East. And recently it's most interesting that we have evidence now, number one, that Amenhotep II fostered cults, Canaanite cults in Pero-Nefer. We have, from this British Museum papyrus, firm evidence that Canaanite cults existed in Pero-Nefer, but also in more remote border fortresses, which were constructed by Amenhotep II at Tel el-Borg, near Tel Hebwa, at the eastern edge of the Sinai. This is a stela recently found by an American expedition near at Tel el-Borg in the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. James Hoffmeyer is the director of these excavations, and you see here Reshef, the god Reshef, and the Canaanite goddess Astarte on the back of a horse, but on a throne. They're not very comfortable for the horse, but you have to take it in a symbolical fashion. Tel el-Borg is situated also on a very important position. It bars the way into the Nile Delta along this reef between the inshore lagoons and the Mediterranean. And here you have Tel el-Hebwa, ancient Sile, Zaru. Why I mentioned this fortress? Because it's important that Amenhotep constructed, obviously, a fortress in this strategic position. Amenhotep also used Pero-Nefer as a major base, military base, and then there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum in Tel el-Dabba. We don't have much evidence of the reign of Thutmose IV. We have no evidence at all, and perhaps in the late reign of Amenophis III, there may have been some evidence, as I will explain you immediately. Then there is what happened and why this vacuum happened, we don't know. There is no text mentioning Peru-Nefer in this period, and it's only mentioned later again. And also military installations on the Sinai only started again with a second fortress, much larger, which according to the pottery found there, which dates to the late 18th dynasty, according to David Aston, who is present, the pottery dates to the time of Horemheb again. We shall see that Horemheb was also active at Peru-Nefer, and it was probably him who started to construct this series of fortresses along the Horus Road, along northern Sinai, which Seti I shows on his famous relief where he chases the Shoso Bedouins from those fortresses which were either partly taken or partly besieged. A strong migration happened at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, but these fortresses, which were thus far mainly attributed to Seti I, the father of Ramses II, may originally have been constructed by Horemheb already, as the evidence at Tel el-Borg shows. This is the Horus Road, and here is the series of fortresses. But let us return to Tel el-Taba, let us return to Peru-Nefer. Yes, what I wanted to mention is the town of Zaru, and it was here that much later Ramses III defended Egypt against the Sea People, against the Philistines in particular, and at the same time it seems that Philistia was created by invasion of the so-called Sea People. But this phenomenon of the Sea People is a much older one, already in the time of Amenhotep III, the famous Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaton, a high official of whom we heard already in 2 lectures today, Amenhotep, son of Hapu, originally a military official who became a very high and important official and later a sage and was considered even a saint. On the inscriptions of statues of him, we get evidence that he was charged to fortify the Nile mouths against pirates. And it seems that in this time, when Peru-Nefer was not active anymore, after Amenhotep II has passed away and the site was left idle, probably because of epidemics, but this is a pure guess. Also the fortress of Amenhotep II in the northern Sinai was abandoned. It seems that pirates, perhaps early sea people, Sheridan, took advantage of this situation and entered the Nile branches and raided Egyptian villages and perhaps even towns. This official was charged to fortify the Nile branches, and the best Nile branches to enter, as I have tried to explain you, because of the winds, the north-northwest, south-southeast going winds, were the easternmost Nile branches, because you could sail into them and you could leave them under sails. We have here evidence by geophysical surveying supplied by the Austrian Archaeological Institute. We have evidence of a fortress wall here, on top of which Horemheb constructed a fortress wall. Originally, the fortress was south of the ruins of the palaces of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. And surely it was constructed by building materials taken from there. And it must be pre-Horemheb. And my guess is probably this was a fortress constructed in the late reign of Amenhotep III, and it was later enlarged considerably by Horemheb, commander-in-chief of the army. And because in this time, as we heard in a previous lecture, Egypt was confronted with a new superpower, the Hittites, who used the Amarna period in the reign of Akhenaton to move southwards, and it was only Horemheb who tried to oppose them, to check them. This may have happened in the reign of Tutankhamun, and in this period it became very important to fortify again Egyptian border towns. Well, anyway, here this is a fortress wall constructed quickly. It has nearly no foundations, but it has buttresses. It cuts through the ruins of the palace of Thutmose III, which must have been already dismantled in order to build the previous fortress, which was to the south of this palace site. And if you can see, this fortress wall continues with a slight bend across this access channel, which was obviously closed. It continues to the east. It must have enclosed the whole harbor. Surely the fortress wall didn't return here. The fortress must have been large, and there is every reason to believe so. Here you can see these fortress walls again. Even you can see the buttresses on this geomagnetic site survey. And here we are. This is the fortress of pre-Horemheb. This is the fortress wall of Horemheb. And most probably it covered the whole Jezira, the whole Turtleback, and protected this harbor basin, which was still accessible from the other channel, but it also must have enclosed the temple of Set, which was renewed by Horemheb. The temple of Set was originally a temple of the Hyksos, because Set of Avaris, it was a formidable temple in the time of the later New Kingdom, 500 meters north-south. And we found a block within this temple, precinct, which we have hardly touched yet in excavation, and found a lintel of Horemheb. But perhaps this is a palimpsest, because it's deeply cut, and there seems to be a previous prenomen, belonging to Tutankhamun. So it is clear that the temple of the Hyksos god Set, who had the features of the Levantine or Canaanite god Baal-Zephon, and not of the Egyptian god Set. This was the Syrian storm god Baal-Zephon, as you can see from this stela from Ugarit, where you see that the god has the same iconographic features. Another stela in Syrian style from Ugarit. The god had a very high cap, but two horns, also on this stela of 400 years, which dates to the time of Ramesses II, but which originates from the temple of Set of Avaris, which was at the southern part of Pyramesse, as we know from the Papyrus Anastasis 2 and 4. Anyway, the origin of the cult of this god is from the time of the late 12th and 13th dynasties, when Canaanite settlers settled in Avaris and later founded the kingdom of the Hyksos. We have found a cylinder seal with the northern Syrian storm god Baal-Zephon as patron of the ships, very meaningful for a harbor, and as the one who has, he's a victor over the sea, represented by the snake Yam on a podest. Yam is a god, the god of the sea. And here is Baal-Zephon as a patron of the sailors. We also have other evidence from the Hyksos period of Near Eastern cults. Here a huge temple which is to the south of the Hyksos temple of Set. Here an excavation of what is known of the temple of Set of the New Kingdom. Just an edge was excavated where we secured this lintel. And it is important that the Temenos wall was all surrounded by a tree grove. Wherever we excavated here, we found in regular distance from each other tree pits going down 5 meters and more. Well, it's important also to appreciate the relationship between Horemheb and what was previously in this precinct in the northeastern delta in Awaris, the old capital of the Hyksos, people originating from the Near East. This is a scarab which is on display in the exhibition, and we only had a look at it yesterday, and I could include it in my lecture. And what is striking, not only you have the name of Horemheb, but the iconography you find on this scarab is partly Hyksos. This sun disk with these very strange wings, and also the tripartite division of the scarab with a sanctuary in the center where the king is mentioned as beloved by Amon-Re and beloved by Ptah. Both had the epithet Lord of Heaven, but the planning or the pattern of this scarab and this winged disc, these are features from Hyksos scarabs. Surely this scarab here was produced in the north at the site of ancient Awaris, and this means that we have evidence also by other means that the original Hyksos population continued at Awaris and was not expelled, and their cultural features continued till far into the New Kingdom. And there was an awareness even of the 19th dynasty who originated from there about a kind of tradition. For this very reason, they propagated their origin from this god Set, according to the stela of 400 years, which I've shown you previously. Here 2 Hyksos scarabs, which number 1 show this tripartite pattern, number 2 here the winged sun disk. Something else is interesting. At Teledaba Gantir to the east, at Jezira Zamana, was found a knob of faience with the names of Horemheb. This is not this knob which was, or this button which was found there, but the Metropolitan Museum has a very good parallel here from Tutankhamun, here from King Horemheb. It's a similar find originates from Jezira Zamana, which is in the Cairo Museum now. Difficult to access, but Jezira Zamana is here, and it was Horemheb who created here not only an enormous fortress, but we also have some evidence that he created a residence here, and perhaps was personally resident here for some times in his career. Here you see fragments of faience and alabaster tiles in a very palatial style, which suggests that within the fortress there must have been a royal residence, or at least a residence of a very high dignitary, which could have been Horemheb. Unfortunately, everything was razed away by the plow, but we still found those tiles. Well, it was Horemheb who laid practically the foundations with the fortress, the harbor, the reanimation of the harbor, the temple of Sutech, the reconstruction of the temple of Sutech, and also with the first installations already at Gantir in the north, according to Edgar Pusch, he was perhaps to be considered the mastermind of a residence here in the north, nearer to the political arena of this period, because Egypt was engaged in warfare, not only with the Hittites, but later also with the Syro-Palestinian states. Therefore, it was very important to have the residence at the northern part of Egypt, a project which only was picked up again by Seti I, a generation later, and the second generation later, the Pyramesse, a site with 600 hectare size, at that time perhaps the biggest town again in the Eastern Mediterranean, was created by Ramses II. But the mastermind behind it may have been already Horemheb, who was defined by Catherine Röhrig at the introduction of this symposium as the first Ramesside. Thank you very much.
Our next lecturer is Nicholas Reeves, who this year is the Sylvan C. Coleman and Pamela Coleman Memorial Fund Fellow in the Department of Egyptian Art here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Before coming to us, he was a curator of Egyptian and classical art at the Myers Museum at Eton College. He has also conducted excavations in the Valley of the Kings with the Amarna Royal Tombs project. He is a specialist in the Valley of the Kings, but also in the time of Tutankhamun. And today he's going to talk to us about the coffin of Haremheb. So please, won't you welcome Dr. Nicholas Reeves.
I have to make this taller. Okay, thank you. Catherine, ladies and gentlemen. Now, okay. Now, by far the finest of the royal coffins recovered from the Deir el-Bahri cache in 1881 is that now published as Cairo Catalogue Général 61020, docketed for and containing the rewrapped mummy of Ramesses II. Despite the labelling and content, however, it's widely accepted that this coffin did not form part of Ramesses II's primary burial equipment. Since the coffin's face bears little resemblance to the pinch-mouthed, high-nosed Ramesses II, art historians have long argued that it must be a replacement. Originally made for an earlier king and supplied second-hand for Ramesses II's reuse at the end of the New Kingdom. It's an assessment with which, in general terms, I'm happy to concur, but much remains unexplained. The precise ownership of the coffin has never been convincingly demonstrated, nor have the logistics of Ramesses II's appropriation of the piece ever been considered. These, then, are the aims of my talk today. Given its obvious Amarna influences, the date of manufacture of CG 61020 clearly falls within the last quarter of the 14th century BC. Precisely where within that 25-year time frame, however, has never been agreed, nor, it seems, fully investigated. Three very different kings have variously been candidates: I, Haremheb, and Ramesses I. Although the list is relatively short, the actual process of facial comparison is far from straightforward. This is because for two out of the three pharaohs, I and Ramesses I, no definitively attributed sculptures in 3 dimensions are known. The statues seen here in close-up on the left are both inscribed for Haremhab. though their facial features differ markedly from established representations of that king, who is shown at bottom right. If sculptures of this quality don't actually look like the king whose names they carry, then there's a clear possibility that these names are added, i.e. in this instance that the Berlin and Vienna statues are images of an earlier king, which Haremhab had subsequently usurped. But if so, from whom? Since they resemble facially no identified pharaoh known to have ruled before Haremhab, by a simple process of elimination, a clear favourite must be the one immediate predecessor king for whom no named images are known, and that is I. This is a conclusion which, somewhat reassuringly, I find was shared by B.V. Bothmer, who was inclined to see in the wide, still intact base to these statues' largely reconstructed noses a likely diagnostic feature of I's official image. If the Berlin and Vienna statues are indeed of I, and it seems to me they can scarcely be of anyone else, then it will be obvious that with their piggy eyes and large noses, neither bears the slightest resemblance to the face of CG 61020. Whoever had been the intended owner of the coffin employed for the reburial of Ramesses II, then on the basis of that coffin's facial features, I would suggest it is unlikely to have been I. With the second potential candidate, Haremhab himself, we're on somewhat firmer ground. In actual fact, a number of recognizable portraits of this king are extant, though for comparative purposes, most valuable for us is the pharaoh's official funerary image, preserved in 2 damaged alabaster canopic heads found among the debris of the royal tomb, KV 57. The best of these heads is shown here at the top center of this slide. The 2 closely cropped images at bottom right allow us to compare directly the features of coffin CG 61020 with this canopic lid. Although the angles at which the 2 photographs are taken differ slightly, the similarities between the 2 pieces are striking, with each displaying the same triangular-shaped face, the same distinctive eyes, and an identical nose and mouth. In assessing the claims of our third potential candidate, Ramesses I, once again, a basic problem is that no definitively identified representations of this pharaoh in 3 dimensions are known. What we do have, however, are images of the man while still the vizier Paramesu, though there are clear difficulties in attempting to recognize in the face of a private sculpture anything approaching subject reality. The reason for this, of course, is that the vast majority of private images tend to carry the features not of the owner himself, but of his ruling king. In a few better quality private works, however, it seems that selected personal characteristics do occasionally shine through. Consider Paramesu's face as seen here in the less formalized of his 2 Karnak statues. In the piece's 3/4 profile on the right, there's a clear echo of the triangular-shaped face of Haremhab, the king who ruled at the time. Who ruled at the time Paramesu's sculpture was made. Not so the front view. This presents a very different aspect, combining with Haremhab's somewhat pointed chin a distinct roundness of face not found in any image of Haremhab as king. Not by chance, I think, is this same plumpness found in certain 2-dimensional images named for Ramesses I, as here on the right in a relief in the vestibule of the 2nd pylon at Karnak. The inference is that facial roundness may have been Ramesses I's dominating facial characteristic. And if that is the case, then it may be a feature we can employ in recognizing a 3-dimensional image of this man in his kingly role. The small limestone sculpture shown here at bottom right is an uninscribed and fragmented dyad of a king and his queen, showing clear Amarna influences. A piece currently divided between the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva, 12440, and the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, 18577. Here again, the features of the principal subject are distinguished by an obvious plumpness, a feature which has so far prevented any convincing attribution. Might it just be Ramesses I, his sole surviving representation in 3 dimensions? If the Geneva sculpture truly does give a flavour of Ramesses I's official portrait, plump and round-faced, then the implications for our present investigation are significant, for the sculpture bears no overall resemblance to the face of coffin CG 61020. If this coffin had not originally been made for eye, then neither, I suspect, had it been intended for Ramesses I. On the basis of facial characteristics, then, the strongest contender for the original ownership of coffin CG 61020 is clearly Haremhab. And here we see again close-ups of the face of the coffin, left, and a detail of the canopic lid on the right. They're virtually identical, as I think you'll agree. But is there anything further that might allow us to actually prove this attribution? One puzzle thrown up by the identification is the logistics of it all. Other than the coffin CG 61020, not a trace of Haremhab's presence may be discerned in either the Deir al-Bahri or Amenhotep II caches. If Haremhab had been the coffin's original owner, as the face does indeed suggest, then would we not expect his mummy to be present within DB 320 also? Or is it possible that there were other circumstances under which Ramesses II had an opportunity to draw upon Haremhab's funerary equipment? To answer this, we need to turn from art to inscriptions. We see here Alan Gardner's manuscript notebook number 70, now preserved in the Griffith Institute, Oxford, opened at pages 68 to 69. These 2 pages contain transcriptions of a group of hieratic graffiti, now sadly disappeared, which Gardner had observed in September 1909, written in ink at the entrance to KV 57, Haremhab's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. By the personnel named, in particular the scribe Butahamen and his son Jehuti Mosi, these texts date to the era Wehem Mesut, repeating of births, a 10-year period at the end of the New Kingdom, roughly 1080 to 1070 BC. Though all 5 of the inscriptions appear to be broadly associated, my immediate comments will be restricted to dockets 1 and 5, shown highlighted here, which records specific dated phases of activity within Haremhab's tomb. In the first of these texts, Graffito 1, the opening 3-line hymn to Amun-Re does not immediately concern us. Gardner's transcription of the remainder of this docket, though, translates as follows. Written in year 4, 4th month of inundation season, day 22, by the scribe of the army, Butahamen, after he came to cause the command, Sejem Medu, to be carried out in the house of eternity in the tomb of King Jesekeperu-Re Setepen-Re, Horemheb, life, prosperity, health. The second important text, Graffito number 5, reads thus. Year 6, second query, month of inundation, day 12. Day of something the something of King Jesekeperu-Re Setepen-Re by the Vizier and General Herihor. Although a degree of uncertainty exists concerning the precise month in which this was written, other dockets we'll consider further below clearly from the same series indicate that gardeners ventured reading second month was in fact very likely. The era itself, Wehem Mesut, repeating of births, assumed in the case of graffito number 1, is of course confirmed here by the apparent reference to Herihor. More of a problem in the interpretation of this text is the correct reading of the verb and its object. The hieratic of the former Gardner initially transcribed as fai, which would translate as something like remove. During a subsequent revision, however, he evidently toyed with an alternative reading, sheni, with the meaning investigate into. Either would suit the context. Since sheni is pretty consistently written with the man with hand-to-mouth determinative, however, an observation I owe to Dr. Rob Desmarais, the presence here of the striking man does in fact seem to favour Gardner's initial reading, fai, as being the correct one. Precisely what Herihor fai'd, or removed, is the king's kasa, or kes. On the basis of an analogous writing, kas, found on the wrappings of the mummy of Ramesses II, I think it's reasonably certain the word is to be understood as a variant orthography of keres, a noun the Wörter book primarily translates as bestatten, or burial, in which case the entire problematic phrase may, for the moment at least, be rendered day of removing the burial of King Haremhab. We'll return to the subtleties of this translation a little later on. The content of the two principal KV57 texts may be summarized then as follows. First, in an unspecified year 4, which by the personnel named must refer to the Renaissance era, during the inundation season favoured for supervisory activity in the Theban necropolis, the scribe most closely associated with such work, Butahamen, visited the tomb of Horemheb to undertake an unspecified command. This task was evidently carried out and memorialized both with a hymn to Amun-Re and this somewhat cryptic record of the activity itself. Secondly, 2 years after the year 4 visit, during the same inundation season, another official party, this time headed by the great General Herihor himself, returned to KV 57 to remove from the tomb the king's keres, or burial. I've mentioned already that these KV 57 dockets, here shown in black, are but two of a series of dated texts from the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere. These are shown summarized here in date order. What is very evident from this table is that the official activity referred to in the Haremhab Year 6 graffito was but one act in a wider program of rationalization at that time underway on the Theban West Bank. The key activity within this program is here highlighted in red, and I'm sorry it's not very visible. Focusing on these key texts, we see that perhaps a mere 5 days prior to Horemhab's move, activity of a clearly related nature had taken place within the tomb of Seti I, KV 17, when Herihor commanded to renew the burial, Wehem Keres, of that king. The very same day, something similar seems to have taken place in the vicinity of the tomb of Seti II, KV 15. While 50 and more days after that, if the season has been correctly read, the tomb of Ramesses II himself was being entered. And on analogy with the virtually identical but more complete Seti I docket, with the aim of renewing the burial, again, Wehem Keres. So, we may ask, what was going on? In fact, the late Ramesside letters explain very clearly what was underway. One of these texts, number 28, written around year 10 of Wehem Mesut by the scribe Butahamen himself, contains the following revealing paragraph. Now see, you, Piank, have written to us, saying, uncover a tomb among the foremost tombs, and preserve its seal until I return. So said you, our Lord. We are executing commissions. We shall cause you to find it still sealed, made ready is that which we know. What, in the wider context, this letter reveals is that certain rich tombs at Thebes at this time were being selected, entered, and exploited, not by robbers, but by the military, seemingly in order to fund Piank's campaigns in the south. And once such semi-official salvage began, it would continue, on and off, for decades. And it was clearly a rough and ready process. Consider, one of the distinctive features of the bodies in the Amenhotep II cache is that several have a hole neatly punched in the top of the skull, as shown here. How are we to interpret this damage? Was it part of the mummification process, in some way ritualistic, accidental, perhaps? No, on all counts. In fact, it appears that the easiest and quickest way to divest a mummy of its bandages and gain access to the jewelry wrapped within was to stand a corpse on its toes, chop down hard on the head with a sharpened adze, and tear from top to bottom the severed wrappings. That, I think, is how the holes we now see in the skulls of these pharaohs were made. And if this activity was official, as I think by its very consistency it must have been, then it paints a revealing picture. Certainly, it gives the final lie to state claims that what was being carried out in relation to the royal dead at this time was, in any sense, pious restoration. Here we see what was typically done to the coffins. The entire surface has been carefully adzed over to remove every scrap of gold foil, and this time demonstrably by the state, since a line of identifying text has been deliberately left intact on the inner surface of the trough. As we see from this surviving text, the coffin is that of Thutmose III, found in the Deir al-Bahri cache, still containing the king's rewrapped mummy. Yet not all of the coffins from the two caches had had their surfaces hacked off in this brutal way. Only those where the gilding had been applied over a thin layer of gesso, and which proved difficult to remove. Where a different decorative technique had been employed, that is, where a carpet of glass and semi-precious stones had been set directly into a ground of thick stucco laid over the coffin's wooden core, as in the case of Tutankhamun's second coffin, seen here, then in such cases the entire stucco surface could be scraped off relatively easily and with virtually no detriment to the wooden ground. This, I believe, is the form of decoration which had originally been applied to the body of coffin CG 61020, carefully scraped off and sanded off to reveal a wooden core in such apparently pristine condition that it has frequently misled us, the Egyptologists, to regard the coffin as an unused blank. Not so. Similarly with this coffin's well-preserved face. In contrast with the thinly gilded surface of Thutmose III's coffin, which could be removed only by hacking, it's obvious that the face of CG 61020 must have been covered originally with a separately modelled mask of thick gold sheet, incorporating inlaid eyes. Similar in construction to the now damaged precious metal face on the Tomb 55 coffin, seen here on the left. Obviously, a covering of this sort would have been detached relatively simply, and if care were taken, without causing damage to the beautifully carved features of the underlying wood. We might consider briefly where this stripping of the royal dead and their coffins took place. Evidently, it varied according to time and circumstance, but in the case of these earliest efforts during Wehem Mesut, when pickings must have been at their richest, there are good reasons to believe that the mummies will have been treated in a controlled environment, such as the fortress temple of Medinet Habu, where, of course, the scribe Butahamen, a key figure in the proceedings, had his administrative base. Indeed, one docket makes specific mention of the temple, Medinet Habu's name, Tahut, as interim destination for the mummy of Ramesses IX following its removal from KV6 in an unspecified year 7. This year 7 has previously been assigned, and it would seem on no particular grounds, to the reign of Siamun. But I think now that it too is better seen as a label of Wehem Mesut, and a direct reference to the place where this particular phase of salvage activity was, at the time, most probably centered. Now, a feature of the mummies treated at Medinet Habu and elsewhere is that several among them, when eventually brought to light in the 2 royal caches, had been placed in coffins to which they had no original claim. Meneptah, for example, lay in the coffin of Set Nakht. Amenhotep III lay in the coffin trough of Ramesses III, and so on. Here we see the coffin of an 18th dynasty private person, a high priest of Thutmose III named Re. Clearly, Re's burial had also been accessed for salvage by the ancient authorities, after which his coffin was reused for the mummy of Ramesses VI during that king's journey to the cache in the tomb of Amenhotep II. In attempting to understand these swap rounds, it will be helpful, I think, to look again at the terminology employed during the salvage and restoration process. In particular, the expression Wehem Keres. Given the way the evidence is beginning to unfold, it's evident that the usual translation repetition of burial rather misses the point. It's becoming increasingly clear, I think, that the focus of the state's efforts at this time was not the burial, but the coffin. In Egyptian, the word keres' basic meaning. Wehem keres, I'm now fairly certain, is to be understood literally here as just that, repetition of coffining. In that light, let us look again at the list of extant dockets from this period, which are summarized here. From the chronological sequence of these surviving texts, notice that Seti I had been an object of official interest and attention before Haremhab, and Haremhab before Ramesses II. Practically, what that means is that Seti I's coffins will have arrived in the restoration workshop before those of Haremhab, and Haremhab's before those of Ramesses II. Gradually, I think, we begin to see how Ramesses II might have ended up in the coffin of a man, Horemheb, he seems otherwise to have had no post-mortem dealings with, either in his own tomb or in the various royal caches. The reallocation of coffins must have been dictated by the sequence in which the dead were evacuated from their tombs and brought into the refurbishment workshops. Clearly, who got what will have depended on who had gone before. Let's consider the case of Haremhab more closely. On arrival at Medinet Habu, he will have been divested of his coffins and allocated a refurbished replacement. This replacement coffin will have originally belonged to someone else, an individual who had previously been subjected to the salvage and refurbishment process Wehem Keres, repetition of coffining. In the same manner, Haremhab's original coffins, having now been discarded by that king, will have been submitted for refurbishing too, in readiness for their own reassignment to a subsequent Wehem Keres client. The pieces of the jigsaw puzzle at last fall into place. So far as the surviving dockets indicate, after Haremhab, the next king to be treated was Ramesses II. 50 or so days after Haremhab had been removed from KV 57 and had surrendered his own coffins to be restored for the use of someone else, Ramesses II was being removed from his own tomb, KV 7, to undergo the same Wehem Keres process, that is, to be recoffined. On arrival at Medinet Habu from KV7, the Ramessid pharaoh will similarly have surrendered his own coffins and been furnished with a newly restored replacement. This replacement was CG 61020. Haremhab's original, freshly stripped of what remained of its overlaid surface of semi-precious stone and glass and reinscribed for its new owner. But what of Horemheb himself? What happened to him and to his recoffined body? Other than his discarded coffin, no trace of the man was encountered in either the DB320 or KV35 caches. Should we have expected there to be? In fact, no. As the evidence of the separated mummy and coffin of Ramesses III conveniently demonstrate, the refurbished dead were dispatched from workshops such as Medinet Habu, not to a single destination, but to a range of separate caches. One of Ramesses III's coffins eventually turns up in the KV35 cache, while his actual body travelled to DB320. Body and coffin had been separated for treatment in the restoration workshop. Ramesses' mummy was re-equipped with the replacement gilded cartonnage seen on the right, while his original coffin, stripped of its gold leaf, was retained for subsequent reallocation to Amenhotep III and shipped off elsewhere. With no obvious trace of Horemheb in any of the known caches, a similar separation obviously took place. While his coffin went one way, his body clearly went quite another. But where to? The likelihood is, in fact, that the body was returned to its original tomb, KV57, in the Valley of the Kings, now officially stripped of its valuables, but we may suppose otherwise left in good order. In fact, this final journey we might be able to demonstrate. The tomb of Horemheb, as brought to light by Theodore Davis in 1908, was a wreck, the burial smashed, stripped of all precious materials, and its surviving contents strewn around. These contents are worth considering in more detail, though. For in the storeroom to the first room off the burial chamber, Davis found a skull and a few bones of more than one person. Within the sarcophagus were found a skull and a few bones, again of more than one person. While in a little side chamber on the right of the sarcophagus were two skulls and some broken bones lying in the corner. Potentially that adds up to quite a few people, certainly more, I think, than can readily be accounted for in the tomb's original 18th dynasty roster. In fact, these multiple human remains, taken in conjunction with the presence of dead flowers found here and there amidst the debris, a characteristic feature of burials and reburials of the Third Intermediate period, raise an interesting possibility that not only was Horemheb himself restored and returned to KV57, but that other refurbished royal mummies were deposited here alongside, in the same way that Ramesses II, following his restoration, was removed back not to his own tomb, KV7, but to KV17, the tomb of Seti I. It's a distinct possibility, in other words, that in its final manifestation, KV57 served as another cache of mummies containing those royal dead of whom no trace was discovered either in DB320 or the tomb of Amenhotep II, KV35. But if so, it was a cache with one significant difference. Whereas by a miracle, DB320 and KV35 survived relatively intact down to modern times, the cache within the tomb of Haremhab, KV57, did not. Clearly, during or after the first millennium BC, it was entered again by persons unknown and its remaining contents utterly destroyed. To conclude, beyond Horemhab's sarcophagus and a few broken fragments of his canopic chest and funerary equipment, only one significant item from this king's burial is preserved to us today. That is his stripped wooden coffin, CG 61020. Thanks, we now see, to this having been discarded by its original owner and refurbished in year 6 of Wehem Mesut and passed on for re-employment by Ramesses II, a king whose own mortal remains, interred within a series of less vulnerable caches, happily were destined to survive. Thank you very much indeed.
So here we have another potential association between Horemheb and Ramses II. Our final speaker today is James Allen, who used to be a curator in this department, so we all know him very well. He then went on to be, I need my glasses here. He went then on to be the Wilbur Professor and Chair of Egyptology in the Egyptology and Ancient Western Asian Studies program at Brown University. We chose Jim to come and give a summation of the talks today. He is an expert in Egyptian history and Egyptian language, in Egyptian religion, and in particular at the time at the end of the 18th dynasty. So we thought he was the perfect person to do this. So here is Professor James Allen with a conclusion for us.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all the speakers today. I've been given the task, as you heard, of summarizing today's talks. And what that means, at least to me, is not the kind of recap we're used to seeing after the Super Bowl, but rather trying to put it all in context. One of the best things about studying ancient Egypt is that there always seems to be new things to discover. A lot of the time, of course, that means archaeology. Finding new things through excavations, discoveries that hopefully fill in the many gaps in our knowledge of ancient Egypt, or that shed new light on what we already know. But it also means rethinking the evidence that we already have, textual and artistic, as well as archaeological, to try to make better sense of what we already know, or at least what we think we know. This museum is at the forefront of those kinds of efforts. Its archaeological discoveries, beginning in the early years of the last century, have given us much of the most important data we have about ancient Egypt. And that tradition is still continuing today with the Egyptian Department's new excavations at the sites of Lisht and Dashur. But the museum's also a leader in the ongoing efforts to fine-tune and even reinterpret our understanding of the evidence that we already have. Seminal studies that were produced by the museum's past curators, particularly those of giants in the field of Egyptology such as Herbert Wenlock and William Hayes, have given us the foundation on which the modern understanding of ancient Egypt is based. But Egyptology doesn't stand still. Those classic studies, as fundamental as they are also flawed in some ways. Not only because new discoveries have forced us to take another look at the evidence, but also because our understanding of ancient Egypt is now more refined and more mature than it was in the days of Wenlock and Hayes. And much of that refinement has come from the work of the museum's present curators, in particular the archaeological and artistic studies of Dieter and Dorothea Arnold. Today's symposium and the exhibition that it complements is an example of that kind of ongoing effort. The Pharaoh Haremhab has been one of the more neglected corners of ancient Egypt's history and culture. Now, how do I do this? Forward. What? Oh, forward. There we go. We grew up with the image of Horemheb that's represented by this picture. It's from the 1954 film The Egyptian. It presented Horemheb as a practical-minded general who tried in vain to inject a sense of reality into the intellectual and idealistic worldview of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who is on the left there, played in the film, by the way, by Michael Wilding, who was one of Elizabeth Taylor's 7 husbands, and he was actually married to her when the film was made. The other two, for your film buffs, are Gene Simmons and Gene Tierney. As my wife Susan says, for many of us, Haremhab will always be Victor Mature. Our understanding of Akhenaten and his ideas have changed radically since the time this film was made. And of course, they're still the subject of debate. But our appreciation of his contemporary, and he was his contemporary, Haremhab, has been in many ways still rooted in the 1950s. In company with the exhibition across the hall, however, today's talks have shown us just how much our understanding of the man and his time have now changed. In retrospect, by the way, this side-by-side comparison of Victor Mature and the image of Haremhab from the exhibition shows that the casting of Victor Mature wasn't all that far off the mark. Today's first talk by Jacobus van Dyck marks one of the more significant changes in our view of Haremhab. Unlike the film that shows Horemheb as a general under Akhenaten, we've now learned that there's no good evidence that Horemheb was in the royal circle before the reign of Akhenaten's successor, Tutankhamun. Professor van Dyck also demonstrated that it was Tutankhamun who put Horemheb in line for the throne, and that Horemheb's eventual accession was not, as many has thought, through usurpation, but through a legitimate succession deliberately established by Tutankhamun. I should also mention that Professor van Dyck, in company with Jeffrey Martin, who will lecture here tomorrow, has also solved one of the long-standing historical problems of the period, which is how long Horemheb actually reigned. We now know it was for 14 years rather than the much longer reign we previously thought to be the case. This new discovery, which was announced last year and has now been published, has, as far as I know, met with universal acceptance, although not with great glee, since it requires us to radically revise our chronology of the period. There will be a colloquium about the problem here tomorrow, and its results will eventually require the museum's Egyptian department to redo over 300 of its labels. The next two talks by Dorothea Arnold and Orly Goldwasser focused on the museum's famous statue of Haremhab as a seated scribe, which is the centerpiece of the exhibition. Dr. Arnold gave us a careful look at the iconography and the cultural background of the statue and put it in context for us in the way that only she can do. Through careful analysis of the statue's inscriptions, Professor Goldwasser showed how its hieroglyphs were deliberately designed so that Haremhab would not have to refer to himself as non-royal, even though the statue was probably made before he became king. Both talks actually neatly complemented that of Professor van Dyck, which in sum gave us a new look at Haremhab before he became pharaoh and showed his careful balance between tradition and his own future as king. Martin Raven's summary of recent work in the Memphite tomb of Haremhab is yet another example of how our study of ancient Egypt is never really complete. In addition to the archaeological discoveries of the Anglo-Dutch expedition of 1976 to 98, the excavations since 1998 have revealed more about the tomb and its owner. And even more importantly, the new work has made it possible to identify numerous statues in museums around the world as coming from this tomb, which gives us in turn new insights about Horemheb and the art at the time of his reign and before he became king. Manfred Bitock's archaeological work in the Delta reveals the extent to which Horemhab's military experience as a military leader under Tutankhamun informed his subsequent building policy in the Delta when he became king. As general under Tutankhamun, Horemheb helped to prevent the Hittites from taking over Egypt, and the series of fortresses that he built in both the Delta and the northern Sinai later proved crucial in the efforts of his successors to ward off the incursions of the Sea Peoples into Egypt. And finally, Nicholas Reeves' talk took us to the end of Horemhab's life, or actually after the end of Horemhab's life, with an amazing examination, archival, archaeological, and textual, putting back the pieces of the puzzle to identify Horemhab's sarcophagus and to give us, again, another major piece of artwork from his time. So what have we learned from today's symposium? Well, first of all, a great deal than we previously suspected about Horemhab's career before he became king. We now know he was designated by Tutankhamun as that king's successor, and this gives us new insight into the monuments and artwork built by Horemheb during the time before he came to the throne. And that in turn allows us to better interpret Horemhab's policies as king and to better appreciate his pivotal role, as mentioned many times today, in the transition from the end of the Amarna period, the time of Akhenaten, to the new Renaissance that Egypt experienced in the early 19th dynasty. We've come, in short, from the hazy, marginal, and inaccurate view of Horemheb epitomized by this image to a more vivid understanding of him as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. Please join with me in applauding today's speakers for the remarkable scholarship and Dorothea Arnold for her vision in organizing the exhibition and this symposium.
That concludes our symposium for today. I would like to remind you that tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock, Jeffrey Martin will speak in Bani Sacerdote Hall, which is in the Uris Center of Education at the south end of the building on the ground floor. This is at 6 p.m. tomorrow night. Because we've managed to finish before 4 o'clock, the speakers will remain in the front of the auditorium for the next few minutes. If you have any particular questions to ask them, please come forward, and thank you for coming.